Welcome to True Crime for Sleeping, where we explore haunting real-life mysteries and tragedies in a slow, calming voice to help you rest. If you find peace in these gentle true crime stories, we invite you to like, subscribe, and comment below. Let us know where in the world you're listening from. Now, settle in. Take a deep breath. Let's begin. Nestled among the quiet folds of the Appalachian Mountains lies the town of Rainwood, West Virginia. It's the kind of place where life moves gently, where neighbors wave from their porches and children still ride bikes until the sky turns dark. There are wild dogwoods in the spring, snow in the winter, and a kind of timelessness in the air, as though nothing truly terrible could ever happen there. But in October of 1997, something did. Abigail Lane was 22 years old when she disappeared. She was a recent graduate of Marshall University, where she studied English literature and dreamed of becoming a writer. People who knew her described her as soft-spoken but deeply observant, someone who found beauty in the ordinary. She often carried a leather-bound journal with her, jotting down bits of overheard conversation, ideas for short stories, or reflections about her hometown. Abigail had returned to Rainwood after graduation to live with her parents while she worked part-time at the town's small public library. She was saving money, her mother said, to move to Asheville or Charleston, someplace with bookstores and cafes, where she could write and be anonymous. But she loved Rainwood too. Her roots were there. On the morning of October 4th, Abigail woke early, had coffee with her father, and told her mother she was going for a hike. The air was just starting to carry the bite of fall, and the trees had begun to turn gold and red. She wore jeans, a navy windbreaker, and hiking boots. She took her journal, a small backpack with snacks, and a silver compass that had belonged to her grandfather. She said she was heading toward Hemlock Trail, a narrow path that wound through the woods behind her parents' property. She'd hiked it dozens of times. It was quiet, secluded, but not dangerous. She told her mother she'd be home by lunch. She never came back. At first, her parents weren't alarmed. Maybe she'd stopped to write or explore off the trail. Maybe she ran into a friend. By mid-afternoon, though, her father, Charles Lane, had started walking the trail himself, calling her name. He didn't find her. By sunset, local police were called, and by nightfall a search had begun. Over the next 72 hours, Rainwood transformed. Flashlights bobbed through the woods, helicopters hovered overhead, and volunteers from all over the county showed up to help. Posters with Abigail's photograph, shoulder-length auburn hair, green eyes, pale skin, were taped to storefronts and telephone poles. Her face stared out from the news, both local and regional. But there was no sign of her. No footprints, no broken branches, no scrap of clothing or dropped backpack. It was as if the woods had swallowed her whole. Sheriff Dwight Harmon led the investigation. He was a quiet man with silver hair and a steady demeanor. He'd grown up in Rainwood and had known the Lane family all his life. He took Abigail's disappearance personally. In the early days, every theory was considered that she'd run away, that she'd gotten lost, that she'd met with an accident, but none of them made sense. Abigail wasn't impulsive, and she knew those woods like the back of her hand. The weather had been clear, and besides, there was nothing to find. Sniffer dogs picked up her scent near the trailhead, but it faded quickly. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no drag marks. The trail itself was undisturbed. Her journal was missing too. 10 days into the search, a call came in that shifted everything. A man named Tyler Walsh, a traveling salesman from Tennessee, had been driving through Rainwood on the day Abigail disappeared. He told investigators that around noon he'd stopped to stretch his legs along a quiet service road near the outskirts of town, not far from Hemlock Trail. He claimed to have seen a young woman matching Abigail's description standing at the edge of the forest. She looked disoriented, he said, like she wasn't sure where she was. When he rolled down his window to ask if she needed help, she just stared at him, then turned and walked into the woods. The detail that haunted people most was what he said next. She looked like she wanted to speak, but she was afraid. Like something was watching her from the trees. The sighting was never confirmed. Investigators combed the area. They found tire tracks, possibly from Walsh's car, and a footprint they couldn't identify, but nothing conclusive. No one could say for sure whether the girl he saw had been Abigail. By mid-November, search efforts were scaled back. Rain fell steadily that month, soaking the forest, washing away evidence. The ground grew soft, the leaves fell, and still no trace of her. Abigail Lane had vanished. Theories multiplied in her absence. Some believed she had fallen and was lying somewhere in the forest, undiscovered. Others whispered about a stranger, someone passing through, who had taken her and slipped away unnoticed. A few even suggested she'd staged her disappearance, though those who knew her said that was nonsense. Her parents were left in a terrible limbo, mourning a child who might still be alive, waking every day to the pain of not knowing. And then in early December, something changed. A hunter named Raymond Kerrigan was walking near a ridge 5 miles from the Hemlock Trail when he found a silver object glinting in the underbrush. It was a compass, old, scratched, with initials engraved on the back, C.L. Abigail's grandfather's. It was the first physical clue anyone had found. The area around the compass was thoroughly searched. Investigators discovered what looked like a small makeshift campsite, flattened grass, the remains of a fire, a few wrappers, and a torn piece of paper that seemed to have been part of a journal page. The handwriting, her parents confirmed, was Abigail's. The message was brief, hurried, and written in pencil. It read, "Not alone out here. Something's wrong." It was the only thing she had left behind. After that, the story of Abigail Lane began to shift from a missing persons case to something stranger, something darker. Theories turned from logical to speculative. People spoke of shadows in the woods, of unsolved cases from decades ago, of secrets buried in the hills around Rainwood. Sheriff Harmon remained cautious in his statements. He didn't believe in ghosts or monsters, but he did believe that someone knew more than they were saying. As winter fell over West Virginia, the forest grew quiet again. The leaves were gone, the ground hardened by frost. The search for Abigail was paused, officially, but in the hearts of those who loved her, it never truly ended. And as the new year arrived, the silence surrounding her disappearance began to deepen, but it would not last forever, because someone far from Rainwood was about to come forward with a photograph that would reignite the case, and the face in that photograph would raise more questions than it answered. It was nearly 3 months after Abigail Lane disappeared, when a man named Micah Keller walked into a police station in Lexington, Kentucky, roughly 250 miles southwest of Rainwood, with something folded carefully in his coat pocket. Micah was 28 years old, an amateur photographer and environmental science grad student at the University of Kentucky. He had just returned from a weekend hiking trip in the Red River Gorge area. He'd gone alone, as he often did, to photograph the sandstone cliffs and the low mist that hung in the valleys this time of year. It was a chilly Sunday evening when he approached the front desk of the Lexington Police Department, clearly uncomfortable, but determined. He told the officer on duty that he might have seen a missing person while hiking, and that he had a photo to prove it. The officer took the folded photo with a skeptical glance, expecting perhaps a blurry wildlife shot or a misunderstanding, but as he unfolded the matte print, he went still. In the image, framed just off-center, was a young woman sitting on a mossy boulder, looking over her shoulder toward the trees. Her face was slightly turned, but her features were distinct: auburn hair pulled into a messy braid, pale skin, green eyes, and a windbreaker that looked navy in the dim light. She was looking straight into the camera, as if she'd just realized someone was watching her. The officer recognized her immediately. It was Abigail Lane. The timestamp on the photo was December 27th, 1997, 84 days after her disappearance. Within hours, Sheriff Harmon was on the phone with Lexington Police, arranging to obtain the original negative and interview Micah directly. He drove to Kentucky himself. When he arrived, Micah repeated his story. He'd been hiking along the Oxier Ridge Trail just after sunrise. The fog was heavy that morning, and the woods were unusually still. He'd heard a branch snap, and instinctively raised his camera, hoping to catch a deer, or maybe even a fox in the mist. Instead, he saw the woman. She was alone, perched quietly on the rock, with a stillness that made her seem almost like part of the forest. He snapped the photo, without thinking. But when he lowered his camera, she was already gone, vanished into the woods as quietly as she had appeared. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. Maybe she was another hiker, someone seeking solitude like he was. But a few days later, while developing his film, he recognized the woman's face from a missing persons flyer, pinned on the university's community board. Her name came back to him slowly. Abigail Lane. That girl from West Virginia. Sheriff Harmon asked the obvious question, why hadn't he come forward sooner? Micah hesitated. I didn't want to get involved. I didn't want people thinking I was trying to insert myself into something terrible, but the look on her face, I don't know. It's been haunting me. Forensic experts examined the photo. The film was genuine, the timestamp matched, the location was confirmed by topography in the background, an outcropping known to hikers as Raven's Point. It was real. Abigail Lane had been alive nearly 3 months after she vanished, and not in Rainwood. The revelation shook the community. For weeks the Lane family had existed in a sort of suspended grief. Now hope reignited, fierce and painful. Where had she been for all that time? Why hadn't she come home? And why did she look so frightened? A new search effort was launched, this time centered on the Red River Gorge area. Dozens of officers, volunteers, and park rangers combed the trails, caves and overlooks. They distributed updated flyers with the still image from Micah's photograph. The rock where she had been sitting was found easily. It bore no sign of her presence, no clothing fibers, no discarded items. But nearby, under a rocky ledge, they found something else, another torn page, yellowed and water-damaged. Only 3 lines were legible. He follows the sound. I stayed too long. The forest forgets who you are. The handwriting once again was confirmed to be Abigail's. Sheriff Harmon stood silently as the page was passed around. Something in those lines gnawed at him, not just fear, but resignation. Abigail hadn't just been lost. She was hiding. The media quickly caught wind of the new development. National outlets picked up the story, spinning headlines like Appalachian Ghost Girl and Vanished Woman Seen in Kentucky Woods. Rainwood, once quiet and removed from the outside world, was flooded with reporters, thrill-seekers, and amateur sleuths. Some believed Abigail had experienced a psychological break, perhaps brought on by trauma or a hidden mental illness. Others speculated about cults, human trafficking, or survivalist groups operating in the mountains. But those who knew her best, her parents, her friends, even Sheriff Harmon, felt something else beneath the surface. Something they couldn't name. 2 weeks after the photograph was taken, another clue emerged. It came from a gas station clerk in Winchester, a small town on the outskirts of the Red River Gorge. The clerk, Linda Mayhew, reported that on New Year's Eve, a young woman matching Abigail's description had entered the store just before closing. She looked dirty, tired and wary. She wore a hooded sweatshirt, 2 sizes too big, and paid in cash. She bought bottled water, a granola bar, and a disposable camera. When Linda asked if she needed help, the woman didn't answer. She just stared at her, then left. Security footage from that night had already been taped over. But Linda was certain. It was her, she told investigators. You don't forget a face like that. She looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. The disposable camera purchase intrigued law enforcement. Where had she gone next? And what had she intended to capture with it? Sheriff Harmon issued a public request. If anyone found an undeveloped camera left behind in the Red River Gorge area, or anywhere nearby, they were to report it immediately. Meanwhile, the Lane family waited. Abigail's mother, Elaine, had stopped sleeping. She stayed up at night, rereading her daughter's old journals, hoping for a clue. Her father walked the woods behind their house every day. Even though the snow had begun to fall, they clung to hope, like it was breath itself. Then on February 2nd, a hiker named Joanna Bridges stumbled upon a campsite in the Daniel Boone National Forest. It was tucked into a narrow ravine, shielded by trees and nearly invisible from the trail. There was a fire pit, a weathered sleeping bag, and what appeared to be several empty granola wrappers. the same brand sold at the Winchester gas station. More chilling was what she found, buried beneath a flat rock near the fire. A small bundle, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, a water-damaged notebook, several loose photographs, and a disposable camera, still intact. The notebook pages were fragile, but legible. They were written in Abigail's handwriting, but different now. Less structured, the sentences were often fragmented, the grammar unsteady. Still there was a pattern. The first pages described her escape. It wasn't the woods at first. It was a place. Something underground. No walls. I don't remember how I got there. There was someone else. A voice. Further entries hinted at her time in hiding. I followed the river to stay hidden. I thought it would stop. The dreams. The sound. But it's louder now. Then they told me not to speak his name. That's how he hears. I tried to warn the others, but they're already gone. There were references to the Black Path, the Watchers, and something she only called the Low Man. Sheriff Harmon and a team of investigators developed the film in the disposable camera immediately. What they found was disturbing. The first several photos were blurry shots of trees, likely taken while on the move. One showed what appeared to be a narrow cave entrance, partially obscured by vines. Another, zoomed in and grainy, depicted a dark figure standing in the distance between two trees. The final image was a close-up of Abigail's face, partially lit by a flashlight, staring directly into the lens. Her expression was hollow, tired, and afraid. She had taken a final photo of herself. And then nothing. She was never seen again. No new sightings. No new pages. No new photos. Despite the clues and growing speculation, the trail had once again gone cold. But one question remained at the center of it all. What had Abigail Lane seen in those woods? And why had she never come back? The photographs, the journal fragments, the accounts of brief sightings, each one was like a faint footprint left in the snow, almost gone before it could be confirmed. But to Sheriff Dwight Harmon, the deeper he ventured into the pieces Abigail Lane had left behind, the more convinced he became someone or something had been watching her. In early February of 1998, following the discovery of the disposable camera and the notebook found by Joanna Bridges, Harmon called in outside help. Quietly, he didn't want media attention, and he didn't want the Lane family to endure another cycle of false hope. He brought in a small group of forensic psychologists, wilderness survival experts, and a cryptanalyst from the state's behavioral sciences division. These weren't conspiracy theorists or ghost hunters. They were trained professionals, people Harmon trusted to analyze what they'd found with a grounded scientific approach. They worked in a secured space in Rainwood Sheriff's Department, going over the journal pages and photographs inch by inch. Dr. Elise Maddox, the lead forensic psychologist, studied the entries for signs of trauma-induced psychosis. Her preliminary conclusion: Abigail was experiencing dissociative paranoia, likely caused by prolonged isolation, sleep deprivation, and stress. However, Maddox paused when she came across recurring references in Abigail's notebook, phrases like "they see when you speak," and "only the trees can hide you." These aren't just ramblings, she told Harmon late one evening. They're structured, repetitive, like someone taught her rules for survival. Harmon sat with that for a long time. He could feel the shape of something forming beneath the surface, like watching fish stir under a frozen lake. The survival expert, a woman named June Carr, was tasked with retracing Abigail's possible paths through the wilderness, using the notes and the terrain. She estimated Abigail had survived at least 3 months on her own, possibly longer, using rudimentary shelters and foraging skills that exceeded what most 22-year-olds would know. She was smart, Carr said, but she was also running, and scared. As they plotted the geography between Rainwood, Kentucky, and the areas where the photographs had been taken, a strange pattern began to emerge. The dots weren't random. They formed a rough arc, a crooked half-circle, that followed the old abandoned logging routes that stretched between southern West Virginia and eastern Kentucky. Some of those roads hadn't been used in half a century. And then there was the cave. One of the photographs, one of the few clear ones, showed what looked like a narrow stone entrance, partially collapsed and overgrown. At first glance, it didn't seem important. But when June Carr overlaid a satellite map, she recognized the area. It was near the ruins of a former coal mining town called Silver Run, a ghost settlement that had been abandoned in the 1940s after a mine explosion killed most of the men working there. The mine was sealed, the company dissolved, and the rest of the town slowly faded into the mountains. Very few people even knew it had existed. Sheriff Harmon remembered hearing stories about it when he was a boy, campfire tales about the hollow men who walked the shafts after the explosion, miners who had supposedly been buried alive and crawled back up years later with pale eyes and black lungs. Of course, he never believed those stories. Until now. On February 12th, Harmon, Carr, and 2 deputies set out to locate the entrance seen in the photo. The hike took them 5 hours. Snow still clung to the north-facing slopes, and the wind carried a low, eerie whistle through the trees. They found the cave just as the light began to fade. It matched the photograph exactly. Moss-covered stone, a half-collapsed archway, a narrow entrance only large enough to crawl through. They took photographs, marked the coordinates, and sent a small drone inside. But the signal cut out after only a few yards. Whatever lay beyond the entrance, it twisted downward. Carr noted that the entrance wasn't natural. It had been carved. Likely a ventilation shaft or auxiliary tunnel for one of the old mining operations. She warned against entering until proper equipment and a backup team could be secured. They left the site undisturbed for the night. When they returned the next day with spelunking gear and portable lights, the snow around the entrance had been disturbed. Tracks. Human. Fresh. They followed them for nearly 100 feet, before the trail veered sharply and vanished down a steep incline. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. No bird song, no animal sounds. Even the wind seemed to hush. Inside the tunnel, they found what looked like an old miner's helmet. Rusted, the lamp long dead. But further in, half buried in silt, was something worse. A cloth scrap. Blue. Windbreaker material. They extracted it, and confirmed by the Lane family that it was identical to the jacket Abigail had been wearing when she disappeared. That night, Sheriff Harmon didn't sleep. He reviewed the notebook entries again and again. He follows the sound. The forest forgets who you are. Don't speak his name. And one final phrase on the back of a torn page they had nearly missed. He's not alone. In Rainwood, people were beginning to talk. Some of the volunteers who had participated in the original search effort remembered something strange, something they had dismissed at the time. One of them, a retired forest ranger, named Hugh Donnelly, said he had seen something while searching Hemlock Trail during the second week of October. A man, Donnelly said, tall, maybe 6'5", wearing brown coveralls. But when I called out, he turned away and walked into the trees, like I wasn't even there. The odd part, there were no footprints, Donnelly said. Fresh snow had fallen. I checked. Nothing. At the time, he figured it was his eyes playing tricks on him. Now he wasn't so sure. Another woman, a delivery driver named Sheila Poe, recalled something else. Around the same time, she'd driven through the back roads between Rainwood and the nearby town of Mercer. One night, near twilight, she saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. She slammed her brakes, but by the time the truck stopped, the road was empty. Later she found a handprint on the side of her passenger door. Large, smudged, like someone had leaned in and watched her. The townsfolk didn't want to say it aloud, but fear was growing. Not just that something had happened to Abigail, but that something else was happening to Rainwood. And then came the fire. On the night of February 21st, a storage facility used by the sheriff's department, where they had been keeping all evidence related to the Lane case, caught fire. By the time emergency crews arrived,
The building was engulfed. The heat had melted the metal filing cabinets. Photographs, notes, maps, the original pages from Abigail's journal, all gone. Some of the staff believed it was an electrical fire, but Harmon didn't believe in coincidences. He still had copies, backups, notes, but the originals, the pieces that carried her handwriting, her fingerprints, her scent, had been taken from them, destroyed. That same week, Abigail's mother reported something even more unsettling. She said that on 2 consecutive nights, just past 3 a.m., someone had knocked on their back door. Just one knock, then silence. When Charles Lane went outside with a flashlight, the yard was empty, but in the frost on the back window, there was a smudge, a faint outline, of a hand. Abigail's bedroom light had been left on. Sheriff Harmon now believed he was no longer investigating a simple disappearance. He was investigating something far older, something patient, and something that was watching him back. He returned once more to the cave. This time, he entered. He and Carr, both geared with climbing harnesses and lights, made their way into the shaft. The air was heavy, mineral-rich, cold. The walls narrowed. At one point, they had to crawl. 60 feet in, the tunnel opened into a chamber, and on the far wall, lit only by the thin beam of Harmon's flashlight, were markings. Dozens of them, etched into stone. Not words, but symbols. Circles, eyes, arrows, and in the center, a rough drawing. A tree with roots that turned into legs, and beside it, stick figures, human. Some lying down, others with their eyes scratched out. The last thing they found in the chamber was a ribbon, worn, faded. Abigail's, her mother confirmed. She had been there. The cave was sealed again, this time under order of the state. Officially, due to risk of collapse. But Harmon knew it was something else. The echo of her voice had gone silent, but something remained beneath the soil, waiting. The turning point in Abigail Lane's case came not with the discovery of new evidence, but with the unrelenting persistence of 2 people who refused to let her story fade: her mother Denise Lane and Detective Julian Reese. It was late February 2012, 5 months after Abigail disappeared, when the smallest detail, almost invisible in the noise of the early investigation, resurfaced. Julian Reese had returned to Abigail's phone records. For what felt like the 100th time, he had pored over every text, every ping, every call log. But this time, he noticed something he hadn't, the first time around. At 3:02 a.m., on the night Abigail vanished, her phone had briefly connected to a cell tower near the Salt Lake Industrial Corridor, a strip of warehouses and derelict buildings west of the city. This wasn't anywhere near Abigail's typical routes. It was out of the way, desolate at night, and silent. The record showed a 5-minute data burst. No calls, no texts, just data, likely from an app running in the background. It was a ghost print, faint and nearly meaningless on its own. But for Reese, it was enough. He drove out to the corridor. That same day, a cold wind pushing clouds across the slate-gray sky. The warehouses stood like forgotten monuments. He parked his car and walked. There was little traffic, and the street smelled of motor oil and rust. The area had been searched early on, Reese remembered. Volunteers and police had swept nearby lots, but those efforts had been hurried, incomplete. He began his own sweep, this time more methodical. Building by building, lot by lot. What he was looking for, he couldn't say. A sign, a piece of clothing, a feeling. It took 3 days before something caught his eye. Behind a long abandoned auto body shop, he found a shallow ditch, overgrown with dry weeds. In it, partially buried beneath layers of leaves and weather, was a tattered pink hoodie, stained, torn at the sleeve. Reese had it bagged and sent for testing. Denise Lane confirmed it matched one Abigail had owned. The DNA results later confirmed what they already suspected. It was Abigail's. The discovery lit a fire under the case once more. The media returned. The pressure mounted, but still no sign of Abigail herself. No body, no confession, no answers. As the investigation intensified, attention returned to the circle of people closest to Abigail in the days before her disappearance. Among them was a young man named Tyler Granger, a former classmate of Abigail's from high school, who had reappeared in her life that summer. Tyler had always been somewhat of an outsider, soft-spoken, intelligent, but withdrawn. He had a past filled with minor infractions, trespassing, underage drinking, even an incident involving stalking an ex-girlfriend. Nothing that rose to the level of major criminal charges, but troubling nonetheless. Text records showed that Tyler and Abigail had exchanged dozens of messages in the 2 weeks leading up to her disappearance, most friendly, some flirtatious, and a few that suggested tension. Abigail's last known outgoing text had been to Tyler. The content of the message had been simple, almost cryptic. "This doesn't feel right." Tyler had never been formally questioned. He had moved to Nevada weeks after Abigail went missing, and hadn't been in contact with anyone from Maple Hollow since. But the resurfacing of the hoodie, and that text, put him squarely back in the center of the case. Detective Reese drove to Nevada with a warrant, and the quiet determination that had carried him through every dead end of the investigation. Tyler lived in a small apartment in Henderson. He seemed surprised to see the detective, but not nervous. He allowed Reese inside. They sat across from each other in the dimly lit living room. Reese noted the nervous tapping of Tyler's fingers, the shifting eyes. They talked for nearly 3 hours. At first Tyler maintained he hadn't seen Abigail in person the night she vanished. "We were just texting," he said. She was venting about her dad, about wanting to leave. Reese pressed harder. "Then why did her phone ping near a warehouse at 3 in the morning?" Tyler hesitated. "I don't know." Reese leaned forward. "You do. You were there, weren't you?" The silence that followed was dense. Finally Tyler spoke, his voice low. "She called me that night, said she needed to get out of the house. I told her I'd pick her up, just to talk. We drove around, ended up out near the corridor. She was upset. I tried to calm her down."
"What happened next?" "We argued," Tyler whispered. "I don't even remember what about. She told me she didn't trust me. Said I was just like everyone else using her." His eyes brimmed with tears. "She got out of the car, started walking away. I followed, tried to pull her back. She screamed. She hit me. And I pushed her," he said. "Harder than I meant to. She fell." "Did she hit her head?" Tyler nodded. "Was she alive?" He broke down. For a few seconds, she looked at me. Then she stopped moving. Reese said nothing. He let the weight of the confession settle in the room. Tyler led them to the site, an abandoned shaft behind the lot where the hoodie had been found. Abigail's remains were discovered there the next morning. The autopsy confirmed blunt force trauma to the head. There were no signs of prolonged struggle, no further violence. It had likely been instantaneous. The town of Maple Hollow received the news with a quiet sorrow. No outrage, no media frenzy this time, just the slow exhale of grief that had been building for more than half a year. Tyler Granger was arrested and charged with manslaughter. At his trial, he pled guilty and received a sentence of 18 years. He showed no resistance, no defiance, only shame. Denise Lane sat in the front row of the courtroom every day. She never looked away. When the sentence was read, she wept, not out of vengeance but relief. "I needed to know," she later said. "Not just for me, for Abigail." The months that followed were slow. Denise and Ron never truly rebuilt their marriage. The strain had worn them down. They remained cordial but separate. Detective Julian Reese was commended for his persistence, but he turned down a promotion and eventually left law enforcement altogether. He took a job teaching criminal justice at a community college outside Salt Lake. "I'd rather help prevent tragedy than chase it," he told a colleague. A small memorial was held in Abigail's name that spring. Friends gathered at the hill behind the high school where she once watched sunsets and whispered her dreams into the wind. They lit candles, told stories, laughed, cried. One of her former teachers, Miss Mallory, read a poem Abigail had written in the 11th grade. It ended with a line no one could forget. Even when the dark is long, I'll be there lighting the path for someone else. In the years that followed, the town of Maple Hollow slowly settled back into its rhythm. But some things were different. At the high school, a scholarship was established in Abigail's name, awarded each year to a student who showed quiet resilience, creativity, and strength. Denise volunteered at a women's shelter, working with at-risk girls who needed guidance. And somewhere in the quiet stillness of the corridor where a life was lost and later found, the memory of Abigail Lane remained, not as a ghost but as a presence. A reminder that even in the safest places, silence can hold secrets. That sometimes, it takes the slow work of listening again and again to hear what was always there waiting. And that every life, no matter how briefly lit, leaves behind echoes that never truly fade. The Hollow House on Winter Creek Road. The house on Winter Creek Road sat high above the rest of the town, nestled against the forest's edge like a relic from another time. With its weather-beaten shutters and grey clapboard siding, it had long ago earned the nickname the Hollow House. Few locals ventured near it, not because of any specific legend or tale, but because it simply gave off a feeling, an emptiness that seemed to seep out from the cracks in its foundation and the dark panes of its windows. In the fall of 1992, a family moved into the Hollow House for the first time in nearly 3 decades. The Caldwells, Mark, his wife Dana, and their 2 children, Emma and Thomas, had recently relocated from Sacramento, looking for a quieter place to raise their kids. Mark had inherited the property from a great-uncle he barely remembered, and while Dana had been hesitant about moving into a place with such a reputation, they couldn't pass up the chance to own a home outright. At first, the transition was smooth. The children, ages 9 and 11, were enamored with the woods that backed up to their new home. Mark, an accountant working remotely, found the silence ideal. Dana, who had left her teaching job behind, spent her days gardening and slowly making the house feel like their own. But it didn't take long before the silence became something else entirely. Not peaceful, but heavy, oppressive. It started with little things. Lights left on in rooms no one had been in. A smell of smoke drifting through the upstairs hallway, despite no fireplace being used. Emma swore she heard footsteps on the porch at night. Thomas began sleepwalking for the first time in his life, always ending up in the same place, at the foot of the attic stairs. Dana tried to brush it off, blaming the new environment and the stress of the move. But the feeling in the house grew colder. Conversations became clipped. The family began keeping to themselves, rarely spending time in the same room. Even the dog, a golden retriever named Tilly, refused to go upstairs anymore. On October 17th, Emma didn't come home from school. The last person to see her was the bus driver, who dropped her off at the end of Winter Creek Road just before 3:30 p.m. She had waved politely and headed toward the house, backpack bouncing. After that, nothing. At first, the Caldwells assumed she had gone to a neighbor's or wandered into the woods, something she'd done before. But after an hour passed with no sign, Dana began to worry. They checked the entire property, the forest behind them, the road leading into town. By sundown, they contacted the Ash Hollow Police Department. The investigation began with urgency. Emma's disappearance gripped the small town. Dozens of volunteers joined in the search. The sheriff, Jim Holloway, who had known Mark's family for years, led the effort personally. But the woods yielded no clues, no clothing, no footprints, nothing to suggest Emma had gone in at all. Over the next few days, the police interviewed neighbors, reviewed Emma's school interactions, and looked into any possible threats. But there was no sign of a struggle, no history of family trouble, no known predators in the area. Emma was a quiet, kind child, well-liked and bright. Her teachers couldn't imagine her running away. As pressure mounted, suspicion began to turn toward the family. A few of the townspeople whispered about the Hollow House, how it had never been right. Older residents recalled stories of tragedies from decades earlier, accidents, disappearances, and untimely deaths tied to that stretch of land. Sheriff Holloway, though not superstitious, noted the pattern in his files. The Caldwells cooperated fully with the investigation. Their grief was raw and open, their desperation growing with each passing day. Mark stopped working entirely, devoting himself to walking the woods at dawn and dusk. Dana, pale and sleep-deprived, began insisting the house itself was trying to communicate something. She claimed to hear voices through the vents, whispers that grew louder at night. 2 weeks after Emma vanished, Thomas began drawing strange pictures. Black crayon sketches of the attic, always with a dark figure standing just behind the doorway. When asked who it was, he simply said, "The man who waits." No one could coax more detail out of him. On November 2nd, a breakthrough came, or so it seemed. A hiker several miles from town discovered a child's blue jacket snagged on a tree branch, partially buried under leaves. Emma's name was stitched inside the collar, but the excitement quickly turned to confusion. The area had already been searched multiple times. The jacket had not been there before. It appeared freshly placed, no signs of weathering or animal disturbance. More eerily, a small tag inside the pocket, one not noticed before, had the words, "She's closer than you think," written in blocky handwriting on a torn receipt. That single clue shifted the investigation's tone entirely. No longer treated as a potential runaway or tragic accident, Emma's case was now a suspected abduction. The FBI was brought in. The house itself became a focus of the investigation. Search warrants were issued. Forensic teams combed every inch, dismantling floorboards, testing for traces of blood, checking hidden spaces. Nothing substantial was found, but an officer noted something peculiar in the attic. The boards beneath the eastern wall had been replaced more recently than the rest. Behind those boards, they found something strange, pages from an old journal, yellowed with time, describing a guardian of the woods and rituals designed to appease him. The handwriting was spidery, erratic. The pages ended abruptly with a chilling line. "The girl must not see him. If she does, she'll never leave." It wasn't clear how old the pages were. There was no name, no signature, but tests suggested the paper had been hidden for decades. Dana became increasingly unstable. She began speaking in disjointed phrases, whispering about watchers in the walls and the attic door that never closes. Mark, for his part, refused to entertain these thoughts, insisting on rational explanations, even as he began sleeping in the living room with a loaded rifle. Thomas, meanwhile, grew quieter. He stopped drawing, stopped talking, and once again began sleepwalking, always to the attic, always staring at that same corner. By the end of November, the Caldwells were a family broken open by fear and doubt. The town that had once welcomed them now eyed them with suspicion, unsure whether they were victims or something darker. And still, there was no sign of Emma. What remained was the house on Winter Creek Road, standing quiet and tall against the edge of the woods, holding its secrets close beneath the wind's hush. The search for Eleanor Voss was at first a patchwork of neighborly concern and quiet worry, but by the second day of her disappearance, something changed. The air around Winter Creek felt heavier, more watchful, no longer just a missing person case. The town seemed to sense that this wasn't an accident. Something had gone wrong, not out in the woods, but somewhere closer to home. Deputy Lyle Mercer took the lead on the investigation. Mercer had lived in Mallow Ridge his whole life. He'd grown up fishing the banks of Winter Creek and hunting deer with his uncles in the October frost. He knew Eleanor, not closely, but enough to remember the way she never made eye contact when she spoke, and always carried her groceries in reusable cloth bags with hand-stitched patches. She was quiet, self-contained, and kind, not the type to disappear. He began the search where it made the most sense, Eleanor's house. The Voss house sat at the very edge of Winter Creek, about 2 miles up a gravel road that looked like it hadn't been graded in years. Thick maple trees lined the property, casting a mottled shade even in the bright morning sun. The house was tall and narrow, a Victorian-style thing with grey wood siding and dark green shutters, half of which hung loose on rusted hinges. Locals had called it the Hollow House since the 1980s, a name that stuck more from the way it looked than from anything specific. A house that seemed to suck in sound and light, like it was hollow inside, and not just the walls. When Mercer stepped onto the porch, he noticed the front door was slightly ajar. That in itself wasn't necessarily suspicious. Eleanor had been known to forget small things, leaving her mail in the box for days, burning tea on the stove. But what struck Mercer was the air inside the house. It was cold, unusually cold, even for late November, and it didn't smell like anything. No old books, no dust, no wood, just a strange, clean blankness, like the air had been reset. He called out Eleanor's name, but the house didn't answer. Inside, things were mostly in order. Her coat was still hanging by the door, her boots neatly placed beneath the hall bench. Her purse sat on the kitchen counter, with her wallet and keys inside. The oven was cold. Her bed was made. The windows were locked from the inside. It was as though she had simply stepped out, except that the back door was also unlocked, and the small sliding glass panel that led to her patio had been left open an inch. It was then Mercer noticed something strange. All of Eleanor's framed photographs, of her cat, of a younger man and woman who appeared to be her parents, of a child standing in front of a lake, had been turned face down. Each one, Mercer didn't touch them. He simply walked the house, taking slow, quiet steps, his breath fogging in front of him, though the thermometer on his wrist read 68 degrees. Something was wrong. Not overt, not violent, but wrong. Outside, the backyard sloped gently toward Winter Creek, which by November had shrunk into a slow, clear ribbon winding around bare oaks and frozen moss. Mercer followed the slight path from the patio toward the trees, calling Eleanor's name. A few yards into the woods, he found something. A single footprint. It was crisp, frozen into the wet leaf litter, a bare human foot, small and slender, like it had been pressed gently into the mud. There were no other tracks around it. No signs of struggle, no animal prints, just one perfect footprint, and nothing more. He radioed for backup. By the third day, Mallow Ridge had become a town wrapped in theories. The gas station clerk claimed he'd seen Eleanor walking along Route 12 with a man in a long grey coat. The church janitor swore he'd heard a woman screaming near the old mining road after midnight. Kids started daring each other to sneak into Eleanor's house after dark, but the property was quickly taped off and placed under watch. Clara Reynolds, who worked at the local diner, told Mercer she remembered something Eleanor said the week before she vanished. She was different, Clara told him, wiping her hands on her apron. She'd been coming in for years, always ordered a single cup of tea, never stayed more than 20 minutes. But last Tuesday, she sat in the back booth for almost 2 hours. Didn't touch her tea, just stared out the window. Did she say anything to you? Only one thing. When I was refilling the sugar caddy, she looked up at me and said, real soft, like she wasn't sure she meant to say it out loud. It's starting again. That's it. Just that. Mercer wrote it down, unsure what it meant. That night, he drove back to Eleanor's house alone. Officially he wasn't supposed to, but something had been bothering him. The turned photographs, the open sliding door, the footprint. He parked down the road to avoid drawing attention, and walked up the gravel path with a flashlight in hand. The sky was heavy with cloud cover. No moonlight, just the pale glow of his beam flickering over the porch boards, as he stepped quietly toward the front door, now firmly shut and locked. He had the key, still tagged and sealed at the station, but he didn't need it. The side cellar entrance had been left open. Slightly, just enough. Downstairs, the air felt different. Warmer almost. The basement was unfinished. Exposed beams, old stone walls, a workbench lined with jars of screws, nails and broken garden tools. Nothing unusual, except that every single light bulb had been removed. There were sockets, wires, even fresh bulbs in a drawer nearby, but not one bulb was screwed in. Mercer's flashlight caught on a small shape in the corner, a shoebox, slightly open. Inside were 3 old cassette tapes, and a folded piece of paper. On the paper, a single sentence had been typed, neatly and deliberately.
The shape comes when the house forgets. That was when Mercer heard it. A faint click behind him, like a door closing. He turned fast, flashlight up, but nothing was there, just the old stairs leading up. But something had changed. He could feel it. A shift in the pressure, like a building drawing in breath. He didn't stay long after that. The tapes were turned over to the county lab, but they'd degraded. Only faint static, with occasional murmurs that sounded like distant voices underwater. No music, no coherent speech. The phrase on the note, "The shape comes when the house forgets," stuck in Mercer's mind like a sliver under the skin. He wrote it down, looked it up. Nothing. No references online, no literature, no archived police cases. Just that cryptic line, sitting in the silence Eleanor Voss had left behind. By the end of the week, the search was scaled back. Officially, there were no leads, no signs of foul play, no evidence of struggle or mental illness. She had simply vanished. But Mercer kept thinking about the footprint, the basement, the photographs. He spoke to a few locals, old-timers mostly, and one of them, Walter Griggs, a retired logger, told him something he wouldn't forget. That house wasn't built right. Walter said, hunched over coffee in the back of the Grange Hall, "You ever notice how it's got too many corners? Windows don't face the right way. It's like someone built it backward." "What do you mean?" "I mean it ain't built for people. Not really. You sleep in there too long, it starts to forget you're in it." Mercer pressed him, asked for details, but Walter just shook his head and muttered, "She's gone now. House took her back." That night, Mercer dreamed of the basement, of the cold, breathless dark, and the shoebox lying open in the corner. Except in the dream, there were more tapes. Dozens, stacked neatly, like offerings, and the last one had his name written on the label. When he woke, he found a single cassette on the passenger seat of his cruiser. He hadn't left it there. No one had access. And it wasn't one of Eleanor's. The label was blank. The cassette tape sat heavily in Deputy Mercer's palm, the dull plastic catching the moonlight through the cruiser's windshield, like a secret waiting to be whispered. He turned it over and over, trying to see if there was a label, a mark, anything to tell him who might have left it there. But the tape was as blank as the cold November sky above Winter Creek. His fingers hesitated on the cassette player as the tape slid in with a quiet click, the whirring of the machine breaking the stillness of the empty car. He pressed play. Static filled the cramped space of the cruiser first. A low, humming hiss that felt thick and almost tactile. Then gradually, a voice emerged from the fuzz, barely audible and fractured, as if underwater. "You're here now," the voice whispered. Slow and deliberate. "The house remembers you. But you must remember it, or the shape will take you." The tape hissed and crackled. Mercer adjusted the volume, trying to catch more words. But the voice seemed to retreat, vanishing behind a wall of white noise. Then through the static, a faint melody, like a lullaby sung far away, began to emerge. It was haunting, sad, and impossible to place. The tape ended after just 5 minutes. The click of the cassette player, ejecting the tape back into his hand, feeling louder than anything else. Mercer sat back in his seat, heart beating a slow rhythm of unease. Who had left this here? Was it Eleanor? A plea from her in the darkness? Or something else? Something tied to the hollow house itself? He drove home slowly, eyes on the road, but mind tangled in the mysterious message. The next day, he went back to the station and made copies of the tape, hoping to get better analysis done. The lab technicians shook their heads. The audio was just too corrupted for anything meaningful to be salvaged. Frustrated, but unwilling to let the case go cold, Mercer reached out to Eleanor's closest friend, Julia Marsh, a local librarian and amateur historian of Mallow Ridge. Julia was known for her passion for local lore and had a reputation for digging deep into forgotten stories. When Mercer met Julia at the library, she was surrounded by stacks of brittle newspapers, Old photographs, and notebooks filled with handwriting that curled like vines. The library itself smelled of dust and cedar, a comforting cocoon of stillness and history. Eleanor was part of this town's story in ways most people never saw, Julia said quietly, as they sifted through a box labeled Winter Creek History. Her family was one of the original settlers. This house, the Hollow House, it was built by her great-grandfather, Elias Voss, back in 1892. Mercer listened, intrigued. There's always been something strange about that place, Julia continued, pulling out an old ledger. There are records here of strange disappearances around the property dating back decades. People who stayed too long, visitors who came back different, or didn't come back at all. Mercer felt a chill. Disappearances, not officially recorded, mostly rumors and whispered stories. But if you look through old journals and letters, you find references to the shapes and the forgetting. Elias Voss was obsessed with, well, something I can't quite explain. But he built the house with strange rooms and hidden corners, a maze meant to trap or confuse. Julia showed him a crude floor plan of the house with some rooms circled in red. One room was simply labeled the Hollow. What's the Hollow? Mercer asked. Julia shrugged. No one really knows. The original blueprints were lost in a fire, but locals say there's a cellar beneath the cellar. A secret room where Elias conducted experiments or rituals, something to do with memory and presence. Mercer ran his hand over the rough paper, heart pounding. Could Eleanor have found something down there? Julia nodded. I think she did, and I think that's why she's missing. They agreed to visit the house together, but Mercer felt a growing weight in his chest, a quiet dread he couldn't shake. The Hollow House seemed alive with secrets, and he feared they were about to uncover things better left buried. That evening, with Julia beside him, Mercer returned to the house. The late autumn air was crisp, the trees silhouetted against a darkening sky. Inside, the house felt colder, as though the walls themselves were breathing. They moved cautiously through the rooms, flashlight beams cutting through the shadows. Julia's eyes flicked over the faded wallpaper, the warped floors, the turned photographs, still face down in their frames. When they reached the basement, Mercer paused. The cellar door creaked open, revealing the same unfinished space he'd visited days before, but Julia spotted a loose floorboard near the far corner. Together they pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling down into pitch black. Mercer pulled out his flashlight, its beam swallowed by the darkness. Ready, Julia whispered. He nodded. They descended. The air grew colder, heavier, and the faint scent of earth and damp stone wrapped around them like a shroud. The stairs opened into a small chamber, the legendary Hollow. The walls were lined with shelves, but instead of jars or tools, the shelves held dozens of dusty glass bottles, each filled with a swirling mist-like substance that seemed to move slowly within. In the center of the room sat a wooden table, cluttered with old journals, ink pots, and a single leather-bound book that looked centuries old. Julia carefully opened the book. The pages were filled with strange symbols, diagrams of the house, and cryptic notes, mentions of memory transfer, binding of the self, and the shape beyond forgetting. Mercer ran his fingers over a passage. The house remembers what the mind forgets. Souls linger, trapped between walls and shadows, waiting for release. A sudden noise made them both freeze, a faint rustling from the corner of the chamber. Their flashlights swung toward the sound, revealing a small alcove where a figure crouched. It was Eleanor, her eyes wide and wild, her face pale as moonlight. She didn't speak but reached out trembling, as if begging for help. Mercer rushed forward, steadying her. She whispered a single word, the shape. Before they could ask more, the floor trembled beneath them, and a deep low growl echoed through the chamber. The mist in the bottles began to swirl violently, spilling over and creeping toward the edges of the room like living smoke. Julia grabbed Eleanor's arm. We need to get out. Now. They scrambled up the stairs as the house groaned, walls seeming to pulse and contract. The last thing Mercer saw before they burst into the night air was the shape, a dark shifting shadow in the hollow, watching them leave. The next days were a blur of hospital visits, interviews, and attempts to understand what Eleanor had endured. She was weak but coherent, her mind clouded with fear and confusion. Eleanor spoke in fragmented phrases about the house, about a presence that took memories, about voices that whispered from the walls, and about a shadow that waited to fill the hollow. Despite her trauma, she insisted on returning to the house with Mercer and Julia to face what had taken her. Their final visit was careful and quiet. Eleanor led them through the rooms, pointing to places where time had seemed to bend, where voices had called her name, where memories had slipped away like sand through fingers. When they reached the basement, Eleanor stopped and looked directly at the cellar door. "This house," she said softly, "it's alive. It feeds on forgetting. If you forget who you are here, it takes you. You become the hollow." Mercer shivered, feeling the cold seep into his bones. They left the house behind, but the sense of something watching lingered in the back of their minds. A reminder that some places hold shadows deeper than the night. The days that followed Eleanor's rescue from the hollow house were filled with a fragile quiet, the kind that stretches thin between moments of calm and the looming threat of storm clouds. For Deputy Mercer and Julia Marsh, the weight of what they had uncovered pressed heavily on their minds. The knowledge that the house was far more than a derelict structure. It was something alive, a place that fed on memory, trapping its victims inside an ever-widening void. Eleanor remained under observation, her health slowly improving, though the shadows that clung to her mind showed no sign of lifting. She rarely spoke of the house, except in broken fragments, her voice distant and hollow like a faded echo. "I don't remember who I was before," she said one afternoon, eyes unfocused as she traced patterns on the hospital blanket. "It's like the house took parts of me and left empty spaces." Mercer listened quietly, unsure whether to believe the surreal account or dismiss it as trauma. But the unease in Eleanor's tone was undeniable, a rawness that spoke of a pain deeper than physical wounds. Determined to find answers, Mercer and Julia continued to sift through the town's archives, desperate for anything that could explain the house's dark power. Julia's research revealed more than just old rumors. It uncovered a pattern of disappearances, dating back nearly a century, each case connected to the Voss family and the house on Winter Creek. One name kept surfacing: Elias Voss, the original builder of the Hollow House. According to the records, Elias had been a man obsessed with the boundaries between life and death, memory and oblivion. Local folklore described him as a recluse, who experimented with arcane rituals in the hopes of preserving the soul beyond physical death. Some accounts called him a visionary, others whispered he was a madman. Julia found a brittle diary, penned in Elias's shaky hand. The pages detailed strange rites and references to a shape that could consume the essence of those who dared to forget themselves inside the house. It described how Elias had designed the hollow, the secret cellar, the swirling mists in glass bottles, as a prison and a sanctuary, a place where memory could be both weapon and shield. As Mercer read the diary late into the night, a creeping sense of dread settled in his chest. The words hinted at something far older than the house itself, a force lurking in the shadows, feeding on forgotten souls, waiting to expand beyond the walls that contained it. Meanwhile, Eleanor struggled to reconnect with the world outside the Hollow House. Each day was a fight against the fog, swallowing her memories, the loss of self threatening to dissolve her identity. Yet within her, a flicker of determination burned, a need to reclaim what had been stolen. Mercer visited often, his presence a steady anchor. "You're not alone in this," he told her gently. "We'll find a way to stop the house." But Eleanor's eyes often drifted away, as if listening to voices no one else could hear. One afternoon she murmured, "The shape, It's not just a shadow, it's a hunger, it's waiting. Her words haunted Mercer long after he left her bedside. Back at the Hollow House, Julia and Mercer prepared for a final exploration. Armed with Elias's diary and a growing understanding of the house's layout, they planned to descend once more into the hidden cellar. This time, they hoped to confront the shape itself, to discover its nature, and if possible, to banish it. The night was cold, and still as they approached the house, the skeletal trees cast long twisted shadows across the cracked windows. The house groaned softly, as if breathing in the night air. Inside, the familiar creak of floorboards echoed as they moved through the dim corridors. Their flashlights pierced the darkness, illuminating faded wallpaper and peeling paint. They descended the cellar stairs slowly, senses sharp. At the bottom, the hollow spread out before them, the glass bottles filled with swirling mist, the cluttered table with Elias's books and notes. The air was thick and heavy, carrying a faint sickly sweet scent. Julia began reading aloud from the diary, reciting discreet incantations that Elias had written, words meant to bind or bash. The mists in the bottles stirred, swirling faster, as if responding to her voice. Suddenly, the room chilled, and a deep guttural sound rumbled from the shadows. The shape emerged, a dark shifting presence that seemed to absorb the light around it. It moved with a slow, deliberate menace, tendrils of shadow stretching toward them. Mercer felt a cold wave of fear wash over him, but he stood firm. Julia's voice grew louder, stronger, as she completed the ritual. The shape writhed and recoiled, shrieking in a sound that echoed through the hollow walls. With a final burst of light from the flashlights, the shadow dissolved into a mist that vanished like smoke in the air. The bottles stilled, the room settling into an unnatural silence. Exhausted but triumphant, Mercer and Julia ascended from the hollow. The house seemed quieter now, less oppressive though still holding its secrets close. In the days that followed, Eleanor's memories slowly began fragmented at first, then clearer, as if the house's grip had loosened. She spoke of faces, places, feelings long forgotten, pieces of herself reclaimed from the void. Mercer watched her recover with cautious hope. Though the house still stood, its power diminished. The terror it held over Winter Creek was broken, for now, but even as they left the hollow house behind, Mercer felt a lingering unease. Some shadows do not vanish completely. Some hollows remain, waiting patiently for the next soul to forget, and the shape to feed once more.
The quiet disappearance of Clara Benson. Clara Benson was the kind of woman who blended seamlessly into the fabric of her small town, a quiet presence in Willow Creek, Oregon. She lived in a modest, weathered home on Elm Street, a place where neighbors knew each other by name, and the days passed with predictable ease. But beneath that gentle surface, Clara carried a solitude few could see. She was in her early 30s, with soft brown eyes and a calm demeanor that made her easy to trust. Her days were mostly spent at the local library, where she worked as an archivist, tending to records and preserving the town's history. It was a role she took seriously, a link between the past and present, yet one that kept her somewhat isolated. Clara's life, for all its quiet routine, was marked by a sense of longing. She had moved to Willow Creek 5 years earlier, leaving behind a fractured relationship and a city life that had felt suffocating. Here she sought peace, perhaps even anonymity. But peace was fragile. In the early morning hours of March 12th, the town awoke to an unusual stir. Clara Benson was missing. Her front door stood slightly ajar, an unlit cigarette still resting in the ashtray by the window. Her car was parked neatly in the driveway, keys left dangling from the ignition. Inside, her belongings were untouched, clothes folded on the bed, books lined on shelves, her favorite teacup still on the kitchen counter. There was no sign of struggle, no note, just an absence. When her neighbor, Mrs. Grayson, noticed the door open during her morning walk and saw no answer after calling out, she alerted the authorities. Detective Marcus Reed arrived at the scene with his usual measured calm. Willow Creek was a town where disappearances were rare, the kind of place where doors were left unlocked and children played in the streets without fear. Clara's case unsettled him. As Marcus stepped inside the home, the silence was palpable. The air smelled faintly of jasmine and old paper. The scent of Clara's favorite candle mingled with the dust of forgotten tomes. Everything was in place, yet something intangible had slipped away. He examined the living room first, noting the absence of any signs of forced entry. The window panes were intact. No footprints in the soft dirt outside suggested a hurried escape or abduction. On the kitchen table lay a half-finished crossword puzzle, the pen resting atop it as if abandoned mid-thought. The puzzle itself seemed mundane, but Marcus found himself drawn to the clue Clara had left incomplete, lost in the hollow. It was a phrase that lingered oddly in his mind. Outside, neighbors gathered in quiet clusters, whispering theories. Some speculated that Clara had left on purpose, tired of the solitude, perhaps seeking a fresh start elsewhere. Others feared darker possibilities, a kidnapping, a tragic accident. Clara's colleagues described her as reserved but kind, with no known enemies. Her family, scattered across the state, were baffled by the sudden disappearance. There had been no calls, no messages, no hints. As the investigation unfolded, Detective Reed began piecing together Clara's last known movements. On the evening before she vanished, she had visited the library for a routine closing shift. Returning home around 9 p.m., according to security footage, she walked calmly through the town square, carrying a small satchel, but no one saw her after that. The mystery deepened when Marcus discovered a series of handwritten notes in Clara's journal, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom. The entries spoke of dreams, strange vivid dreams about an old hollowed tree in the nearby forest, a place Clara described as a doorway between what was and what could be. The handwriting grew more erratic as the entries progressed, hinting at an obsession with the tree and what might be hidden beneath it. Intrigued and unsettled, Marcus decided to visit the forest the next morning. The air was crisp, the early spring sun filtering through budding branches as he approached the clearing Clara had described. At its center stood a massive ancient tree, its trunk gnarled and hollowed with age. The ground around it was soft and moss-covered, as if untouched for years. As Marcus circled the tree, he found shallow footprints leading away from the hollow, heading deeper into the woods. The trail was faint but distinct, a sign that Clara had ventured beyond the safety of town, following some unseen thread. A few miles away, in the depths of the forest, an old stone well lay half buried under fallen leaves and vines. It was a relic from the town's earliest days, forgotten and overgrown. Nearby, an old leather-bound book rested atop a mossy rock, its pages yellowed and brittle, filled with cryptic symbols and faded writing. Marcus picked it up cautiously, feeling the weight of history and something else, a quiet urgency. The book mentioned a legend tied to the hollow tree, a gateway said to blur the lines between reality and memory, between the living and the lost. The story was unsettling, but it did not explain Clara's disappearance. Was it possible she had discovered something she was never meant to find? Or had the forest, the hollow, claimed her in some inexplicable way? Back in Willow Creek, the community struggled with the growing absence of one of their own. Vigils were held, flyers posted and search parties organized. Yet with each passing day, hope began to dim. For Detective Marcus Reed, the case became more than a missing person. It was a journey into the quiet places where memory and reality intertwine, and where the smallest fissure in the familiar can lead to profound loss. As night fell over Willow Creek, the hollow tree stood silent and waiting, a dark heart at the edge of the forest, guarding secrets that might never be fully understood. The following morning arrived cold and grey, with a thin veil of mist curling over the sleepy town of Willow Creek. The forest, too, seemed draped in a veil of quiet uncertainty, as if holding its breath after the discoveries of the previous day. Detective Marcus Reed found himself returning to the edge of the woods, the weight of the old book heavy in his satchel. The townsfolk's whispered questions trailed after him like shadows. Where was Clara? What had drawn her so far from the safety of her home? What secrets did the hollow tree conceal? Marcus settled beneath the dense canopy, its filtered light casting muted patterns across the forest floor. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of pine and earth, and the soft sounds of distant birdsong lent a fragile normalcy to the moment. But beneath the natural calm, Marcus sensed something else, a lingering tension, as if the very soil beneath him held stories waiting to be uncovered. The leather-bound book beckoned. Marcus opened it carefully, running his fingers across its brittle pages. The script was faded, but still legible, a mixture of handwritten notes and printed text, with an uneven rhythm that suggested multiple authors over time. The language was archaic, dense with symbolism, but certain passages stood out, especially those that spoke of the hollow tree as a locus, a place where time folded in on itself. One passage, written in ink so faint it was almost invisible, read, "Here lies the portal, where the veil thins between the seen and unseen. The hollow heart reveals what is hidden beneath the surface, but only to those who dare to listen." Marcus closed the book slowly, feeling an unsettling connection to Clara's own notes. She had been drawn here by something profound, something intangible, but compelling enough to pull her away from her life and into the unknown. He traced the footprints from the previous day, following the path deeper into the woods. The trail led past the ancient well and curved along a narrow creek that whispered softly between moss-covered stones. The world here felt untouched by time, a place suspended between past and present. After nearly an hour of careful walking, Marcus came to a small clearing he had not noticed before. A circle of stones formed a rough ring around a patch of disturbed earth, as if something had been buried or unearthed recently. The ground was softer here, marked by faint impressions that suggested more than just animal activity. He knelt, brushing away the leaves and dirt to reveal fragments of a weathered piece of fabric, threadbare and darkened with age. A glimmer of metal peeked from beneath the soil, a small rusted locket, its clasp broken but still intact. Inside, a faded photograph of a woman stared back at him, her expression serene but tinged with melancholy. Marcus pocketed the locket, his mind turning over the possibilities. Was this place a shrine, a memorial, or something else entirely? And how did it connect to Clara's disappearance? As he continued to search the perimeter of the clearing, Marcus felt a sudden chill brush past him, a faint whisper of movement in the shadows. For a moment, the forest seemed to grow still, as if listening. He stood slowly, eyes scanning the dense foliage. There was nothing there, only the quiet rustle of branches and the distant call of a crow. The forest silence was heavy with unspoken stories, and Marcus sensed that Clara's fate was entwined with this ancient place. But the more he uncovered, the more elusive the truth seemed. Back in town, the investigation pressed on. Marcus met with Clara's friends and acquaintances, piecing together a portrait of a woman both fragile and resilient. They described her as introspective, often lost in thought, with a deep love for the natural world that bordered on reverence. One friend, Emily Dawson, shared memories that cast a softer light on Clara's inner world. "She was drawn to the woods," Emily said quietly. "Sometimes I thought she found more peace among the trees than anywhere else. She talked about the forest like it was alive, like it was listening." Emily's words resonated deeply with Marcus. The forest was not just a setting, but a character in Clara's story, a silent witness to her hopes, fears, and ultimately, her disappearance. The community's concern grew palpable. Flyers with Clara's photo appeared on telephone poles, in grocery stores, and along the town's main street. Her face, calm and unassuming, seemed to watch over the town with an unfulfilled longing. Every day, new tips trickled in, some plausible, others less so, but none led to a concrete breakthrough. The nights were the hardest for Clara's family. Her younger brother Jacob drove from city to city, canvassing nearby towns, and spreading word of her disappearance. His voice cracked on the phone when he called Marcus, desperate for answers but aware of how thin they were. Meanwhile, Marcus delved into Clara's personal history, seeking clues that might illuminate her state of mind. Her journals revealed layers of complexity, a woman wrestling with isolation, and a deep need for connection, grappling with shadows from her past that had never fully released their hold. One entry in particular stood out. "Sometimes the silence feels too loud. The past is a heavy stone pressing against my chest. I feel drawn to the hollow tree, as if it holds a secret meant only for me. But what if some doors should remain closed?" The vulnerability in her words struck Marcus profoundly.
Clara was not just missing physically, she seemed caught in a liminal space, torn between worlds she could not fully name. As days turned into weeks, the search expanded beyond the forest's edge. Volunteers combed through fields, abandoned buildings, and even the river that traced Willow Creek's border. Yet no trace of Clara surfaced. In the quiet moments, Marcus returned to the hollow tree. He sat beneath its gnarled branches, the ancient bark rough against his back, and allowed himself to imagine Clara there, searching, perhaps hoping, caught in a space where past and present blurred. There was no easy explanation for her disappearance, no ransom note, no signs of violence, no footprints leading to a clear destination. The forest, with its timeless hush, kept its secrets close. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows over the town, Marcus received an unexpected call from a local historian, Alice Morgan. She had spent years researching the folklore of Willow Creek, and offered insights that added a new layer to the mystery. The hollow tree, Alice explained over the phone, is tied to an old legend about a spirit that guards the forest, protecting it from those who would exploit it. It's said that those who seek the hollow tree with pure intention may find peace, but others might never return. Her voice was calm but tinged with something deeper, a reverence born from living in the shadow of the unknown. Marcus listened intently, feeling the weight of history pressing against the present. He wasn't a man given to superstition, but Clara's disappearance demanded a different kind of understanding, one that bridged reason and belief. Alice agreed to meet him the next day, hoping to share more of the town's hidden stories. Perhaps, Marcus thought, the key to finding Clara lay not just in searching the physical world, but in understanding the stories that had shaped Willow Creek's soul. As night settled over the town once again, the hollow tree stood silent in the moonlight, a quiet sentinel watching over a mystery that stretched beyond time, beyond explanation. Marcus felt the enormity of the search ahead. Clara Benson was missing, not just in body, but in the delicate space where memory, myth and reality converged. And until that space was understood, the forest would keep its secrets, and the town of Willow Creek would hold its breath. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of the Willow Creek Library, where Marcus Reed sat across from Alice Morgan. The room was lined with weathered shelves, holding decades of local history, old newspapers, town records, diaries and fragile maps stained with time. Alice's presence brought a quiet intensity, her knowledge of Willow Creek's folklore filling in gaps that official reports never touched. The forest is more than just trees and trails, Alice began, her voice gentle but unwavering. It's a repository for the town's fears, hopes and memories. The hollow tree you found, it's woven into our collective story. But it's not just a tree, it's a marker for something older, something almost forgotten. Marcus listened closely, fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. Older how? What do you mean? Alice glanced toward the window, as if the morning mist held the answer. Long before settlers arrived, this land was sacred to the indigenous people who lived here. They believed the hollow tree marked a portal, a boundary between our world and the spirit world. It was a place for rites, for seeking guidance, and sometimes for sacrifice. The stories faded over time, but the respect remains. Marcus swallowed, feeling the weight of that history settle in his chest. And Clara, she believed this too. Perhaps not in the exact same way, Alice said carefully, but Clara was deeply drawn to the spiritual side of things. Her journals hinted at a search for meaning, a connection beyond what we can see. The fact that she was found near that tree, and left those cryptic notes, it suggests she was reaching for something. Maybe answers, maybe peace. The detective nodded slowly, feeling the threads of the investigation tighten around the delicate fabric of myth and reality. It was becoming clear that finding Clara required more than just physical searching. It demanded a journey into the heart of Willow Creek's silent history. Alice opened a heavy tome, revealing a faded map of the region from the late 1800s. Look here, she said, pointing to a cluster of symbols near the forest's edge. Circles and lines, marks that could be mistaken for natural features, but were in fact ritual sites. This was an area used for ceremonies, she explained. People came here to ask for protection, to communicate with the unseen. The hollow tree sits at the center of it all. Marcus studied the map, noting the precise location of the clearing he had discovered with the stone ring. He remembered the broken locket buried in the earth, a silent testament to a story still unfolding. After their meeting, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He arranged to meet with the town's elders, hoping to unearth more about the lingering beliefs that might illuminate Clara's disappearance. Some elders were hesitant, reluctant to discuss these old tales with an outsider, but others, especially those with family ties to the original inhabitants, shared fragments of stories, warnings whispered over generations. One elder, Mrs. Helen Carter, spoke with a quiet conviction. "The forest listens," she said, her eyes steady. "It knows who walks there with respect, and who does not." Clara was different. She had a gentle heart, but the forest is tricky. It does not give up its secrets easily. Helen's words echoed the warning from the book Marcus had found. The forest, it seemed, was both a protector and a keeper of mysteries, and those who entered its realm were changed forever. Meanwhile, the investigation moved beyond folklore. Marcus coordinated with search teams to focus on a perimeter around the forest's ancient sites, including the clearing with the stone ring. New volunteers joined daily, and the town's sense of urgency deepened. Clara's family remained steadfast, clinging to hope. Her mother, Margaret, insisted on daily vigils, lighting candles at the edge of the woods and whispering prayers into the night. Jacob, Clara's brother, pushed himself harder, refusing to rest until his sister was found. One evening, Marcus accompanied Jacob into the forest, tracing once again the path Clara had taken. The silence was profound, broken only by their footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. Jacob paused beneath the hollow tree, his breath visible in the cold air. "I keep thinking she's here, somewhere," he whispered, "that she didn't want to be found, or maybe she's waiting for us to understand." Marcus nodded, but said nothing. The feeling was mutual, an unspoken acknowledgement that Clara's disappearance was wrapped in layers deeper than any straightforward case. As they walked back toward town, Marcus's phone rang. A new lead. It was from a local man named Peter Wallace, a hunter familiar with the forest's back trails. He reported hearing strange noises near the creek at dusk, soft chanting, the flicker of torchlight, and fleeting shadows moving through the trees. Marcus's heart quickened. Could there be others drawn to this mystery, or was someone deliberately hiding something? That night, Marcus returned to the clearing alone, flashlight in hand. The forest seemed alive with possibility, every whisper of wind and snap of twig hinting at secrets just beyond reach. He paced slowly around the stone ring, noticing fresh footprints leading away from the site toward the denser woods. The prints were small, light, possibly belonging to a woman. Following the trail carefully, Marcus moved deeper into the forest, his senses alert. The scent of damp earth and decaying leaves filled the air, mingled with something faintly floral, perhaps wild honeysuckle. Suddenly, the path opened into a narrow gorge, where the creek widened, and the trees grew taller, ancient sentinels watching over the land. In the fading moonlight, Marcus spotted a figure crouched by the water's edge, her outline fragile and trembling. His breath caught. "Clara," he called softly. The figure turned slowly, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief. "Yes," she whispered, voice barely audible over the rush of water. Clara Benson was alive. The soft glow of Marcus's flashlight barely penetrated the thick canopy above as Clara Benson stood in the narrow gorge, her figure fragile but unmistakably real. The sound of the creek's steady rush filled the silence between them, a natural cadence to a moment suspended in time. Marcus took a careful step forward, lowering his light to avoid startling her further. "Clara," he said gently, "we've been looking for you. Everyone's worried." Her eyes, wide and glassy, flickered with a mixture of confusion, fear and something else, a quiet resignation that ran deeper than mere exhaustion. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, slowly, her voice came, trembling and soft. "I didn't mean to disappear," she whispered. "I didn't mean to make anyone scared." Marcus crouched down, maintaining a respectful distance, sensing the delicate balance between offering help and overwhelming her. Can you tell me what happened? Why you stayed here? Clara's gaze drifted toward the water, the moonlight casting shifting shadows on her face. I needed to find something, she said. Something that would make the noise in my head stop. The forest. It's quieter here. It listens in a way people don't. The detective felt the weight of those words, their truth both mysterious and painfully human. Clara had spoken of her struggles before. Anxiety. The feeling of being trapped in her own mind, searching for relief that never quite came. Now it seemed, her disappearance was less about escape and more about seeking refuge in the only place that offered some semblance of peace. We've been searching everywhere, Marcus said softly. Your family, your friends, they need to know you're safe. Clara nodded, tears beginning to well in her eyes. I'm sorry for making them worry. Slowly, Marcus helped her to her feet, and together they made their way back along the narrow trail, the forest seeming to embrace her return with a quiet stillness. The walk was slow, careful, with Marcus supporting her when she faltered. By the time they reached the edge of the woods, the first hints of dawn were breaking over Willow Creek. The sky was a soft gradient of pink and blue, a gentle promise of renewal after a long dark night. Waiting there were Clara's family, Margaret, her mother, and Jacob, her brother, who rushed forward, their faces etched with relief and disbelief. Margaret's arms enveloped Clara in a trembling hug, while Jacob's voice cracked with emotion as he whispered, "We thought we lost you." Clara clung to them, her sobs mingling with the morning breeze. The reunion was raw and tender, a quiet testament to the enduring strength of family even amid uncertainty. In the days that followed, Clara's return became a turning point for Willow Creek. The town's collective anxiety gave way to cautious hope, but questions remained. Why had Clara vanished into the forest? What had she been searching for? And how had the hollow tree and its ancient mysteries played a part in her? Clara, now back home, began the slow process of healing. She spoke little about the specifics of her time in the forest, choosing instead to focus on recovery and reconnecting with those she loved. Her journals, filled with sketches and fragmented thoughts, were carefully reviewed by mental health professionals who sought to understand her inner world. The case had highlighted the fragile boundary between mental health and the unknown, how deeply personal struggles can sometimes lead a person into places where myth and reality blur. For Marcus, it was a reminder of the human element behind every investigation, a story that transcended facts and statistics. Months passed, and life in Willow Creek settled back into its quiet rhythm. The hollow tree remained, standing silently at the forest's heart, a symbol both of mystery and resilience. Some locals continued to speak of it in hushed tones, respecting its power without fully understanding it. For Clara, the forest was no longer a place of escape, but a chapter in her life that taught her about vulnerability and strength. She began to participate in community programs focused on mental health awareness, using her experience to help others facing similar darkness. Though her disappearance would always be part of Willow Creek's story, it was no longer a tale of loss, but one of survival, connection, and the complex ways we seek light in the deepest shadows.
Whispers in the fog. The hunt for the East Bay Strangler. In the early 1970s, the San Francisco Bay Area was a place of change and unrest. The fog rolled in thick and heavy along the coastline, shrouding the city's edges in a cold, damp veil that blurred the boundary between safety and danger. Beneath this mist, a shadow moved, elusive, calculating, and merciless. The press would come to call him the East Bay Strangler, a name whispered in fear from Oakland to Berkeley. Over the course of several years, the Strangler's reign of terror would leave a chilling trail of victims and unanswered questions that haunted the city's collective consciousness. The first known victim was 22-year-old Diane Marshall. She disappeared on a chilly October evening in 1971 after leaving a diner in downtown Oakland. Diane was last seen walking to her car, a dark-haired student with a bright future and a smile that masked her quiet determination. When Diane failed to show up for a class the next morning, friends grew concerned. A search began, spreading through local neighborhoods and public parks. Days later, her body was found in a secluded area near Lake Merritt, a place where the fog hung low over the water like a veil. She had been strangled, left carefully positioned beneath a willow tree, her hands folded over her chest in a haunting stillness. Detective Frank Harper, newly assigned to the Oakland Homicide Division, was the lead investigator on Diane's case. He was a man of quiet resolve, with a face weathered by years of chasing shadows and a voice that carried the calm steadiness of someone used to confronting darkness. From the start, Frank sensed there was something different about this crime, a calculated precision, a chilling detachment. The strangulation was methodical, and the scene almost ritualistic. As the investigation unfolded, more victims emerged, all young women, all found in similar circumstances, strangled, left in quiet places, their deaths marked by a signature that sent a clear message. The city was gripped by fear. Women moved cautiously, clutching keys between their fingers, avoiding dimly lit streets. The police increased patrols, but the strangler seemed always a step ahead, a ghost in the fog. Frank worked tirelessly, piecing together fragments of evidence and witness statements. He collaborated with forensic experts, poring over fibers, fingerprints, and clues that might crack the case wide open. But the killer left no trace, no confession, only silence. Among the victims, subtle differences suggested the killer was learning, adapting, growing more cautious. Some scenes included small tokens, a red scarf here, a single white lily there, symbols the press quickly sensationalized, but which Frank viewed with skepticism, wary of distractions. In the shadows of the city, rumors spread. Some said the strangler was a loner, a man scarred by his past. Others whispered of a disturbed mind, hiding behind a respectable facade. But Frank knew the truth would not come from gossip, only from patient, relentless work. One night, as the fog rolled in thicker than ever, Frank sat alone in his office, a blackboard filled with photos and notes before him. The weight of the unsolved cases pressed down like the dense mist outside. He thought of Diane, of all the women who had lost their lives. Their faces haunted his dreams, urging him forward. He knew this was more than a case. It was a race against time, a test of his ability to bring justice to those silenced in the fog. The East Bay Strangler was still out there, and Frank Harper was determined to find him. The city remained under a blanket of unease as autumn bled into winter, the days shortening and the fog thickening along the shores of the bay. Detective Frank Harper moved through the damp streets like a man carrying a quiet weight, the images of the victims etched deeply in his mind. Each one was a puzzle piece, each crime scene a fragment of a grim story he was desperate to understand. Following Diane Marshall's murder, the East Bay Strangler continued his terrifying pattern. Over the next several months, more young women vanished, each disappearance sending waves of dread rippling through neighborhoods already on edge. The killer's signature, the precise method of strangulation, the careful placement of bodies in secluded locations, became a chilling hallmark, yet no one could predict where he would strike next. Frank's investigations led him into the lives of the victims, trying to find a thread that might connect them beyond their brutal ends. Most were in their early 20s, like Diane, students, clerks, waitresses, young women living quiet lives in a city full of noise. Yet, despite their varied backgrounds, there was little to link them beyond their untimely deaths. One such victim was Anna Latham, a shy art student who disappeared one rainy evening while walking home from a gallery in Berkeley. Her body was found a week later, wrapped in a faded blue blanket near the shoreline, hands folded over her chest like a somber echo of Diane's final repose. The rain had blurred the edges of the scene, washing away potential clues, leaving Frank to wonder if the killer had chosen the elements to mask his crimes. Frank's team combed through the lives of the women, tracing their last days in meticulous detail. They interviewed friends, co-workers and family members, seeking any hint of a strange encounter or a name that might have slipped from memory. Slowly, a pattern emerged, one not in the victims themselves but in the spaces they occupied in the city's shifting social landscape. All the victims frequented the same late-night diners and bus stops, often traveling alone after work or class. They all walked home through neighborhoods where the city's light dimmed into shadows too thick to penetrate. It was as if the killer was waiting in those transitional places, between safety and vulnerability. At one point a witness came forward, an older woman who had seen a man lingering near the scene where Anna's body was found. He was described as unremarkable, wearing a dark jacket and a hat pulled low, blending into the fog like a shadow made flesh. His face was never clearly seen, but the fleeting glimpse was enough to reignite the investigation. Detective Harper pushed the team to focus on this mysterious figure, hoping that the witness might have noticed something more, an idiosyncrasy, a limp, a distinctive gesture. But the trail grew cold again, slipping through their fingers like the fog that settled nightly over the bay. The killer was patient, and so was Frank. As the months wore on, Frank became obsessed with the idea that the strangler might be someone who knew the city intimately, a local who understood the ebb and flow of its fog, the rhythms of its streets, and the quiet places where a scream might never be heard. This belief pushed him to widen his investigation beyond the victim's immediate circles. He began to look into men with past convictions related to violence or sexual assault, men who had lived in or near the neighborhoods where the bodies had been found. Records were pored over, leads followed, and background checks performed. Yet, every promising suspect seemed to unravel under scrutiny, their alibis firm or their connections too tenuous. Frank's nights became longer, filled with files and photographs pinned to walls, maps with routes marked, and notes scrawled with fragments of conversations. The investigation consumed him, isolating him from friends and family, drawing him deeper into a dark world where hope flickered uncertainly. One breakthrough came unexpectedly, not from the evidence itself but from the voice of a young woman named Claire Hastings. She was not a victim, but her story would soon become crucial. Claire had been out late one night, walking home from a library shift when she noticed a man following her. His steps quickened when she glanced back. Panic rising, she crossed the street, hoping to lose him in the fog's thickness. But the footsteps persisted. In a nearby parking lot, she spotted a security guard's booth. Running inside, she locked the door behind her and called the police. When officers arrived minutes later, the man was gone. Her description matched the one given by the older witness: dark clothing, hat pulled low, moving like a shadow. Claire's courage to come forward offered a glimmer of hope, but also confirmed the strangler's boldness and his readiness to escalate. Detective Harper felt the weight of responsibility deepen. He knew the killer's confidence was growing, and the city's fear was mounting. He redoubled efforts to organize stakeouts near known hotspots, coordinating with patrol officers to monitor the fog-covered streets where the strangler might strike again. Each night, the city became a labyrinth of watchful eyes and nervous whispers. Despite these measures, the killer's presence remained elusive. No arrests, no definitive leads. The fog had become a cloak for his cruelty. Yet within the darkness, Frank found solace in small victories: a witness coming forward, a partial fingerprint recovered on a victim's clothing, a call tip that sent officers rushing into the night. Each clue was a thread, tenuous but precious. But the strangler's true nature remained a mystery. Was he driven by rage or something deeper? Did he seek control, or was he trapped by his own demons? The psychological profile painted a picture of a man isolated, haunted, meticulous in his planning, yet reckless enough to repeat his crimes in a confined area. The victims were not just statistics, they were lives shattered, dreams extinguished. Frank made it his mission to honor their memory, to see beyond the headlines and the headlines' hunger for horror. His mind often returned to Diane, Anna, Claire, and the others, to their smiles, their hopes, their quiet presence in a city that now seemed indifferent. Each step forward in the case was a testament to their stories, a promise that they would not be forgotten. And so, beneath the fog and the cold, Detective Harper waited, listened, and watched, determined to bring the East Bay Strangler into the light. The winter deepened over the East Bay, shrouding the city in a grey mist that seemed almost eternal. The fog, so characteristic of the Bay Area, had taken on a sinister quality for many residents, an ever-present veil that blurred reality and fear. For Detective Frank Harper, it was as if the fog had settled not just over the city, but into his very thoughts, obscuring clarity and casting long shadows where answers should be. By now, the city had suffered 6 known attacks attributed to the East Bay Strangler, and the pattern was tragically consistent. Each victim had been strangled with a unique ligature, a thin leather cord, a knitted scarf, a length of rope, carefully chosen and tightly bound. The meticulous nature of the strangulations revealed a calculated, methodical killer who understood his actions and relished the control they gave him. Frank often found himself replaying the crime scenes in his mind, trying to imagine what the victims must have experienced in those final moments. The sudden fear, the helplessness, the quiet fading of life in a strangling grip. These thoughts haunted him in the silence of his small apartment, where the walls seemed to close in, and the weight of the unsolved case pressed heavily on his chest. At the precinct, the investigation had become the defining force of Frank's days and nights. The media had dubbed the murderer the East Bay Strangler, a title that spread fear through the community and brought intense scrutiny to the police. There was pressure to produce results, to find the killer before more lives were lost, but the killer seemed always a step ahead. In early December, a break finally came, not from the crime scenes themselves but from the fringes of the investigation. A young man named Victor Ramirez, a clerk at a local bookstall, had been arrested for an unrelated burglary. During questioning, he casually mentioned having seen a man behaving oddly near one of the sites where a victim had disappeared. Though Victor's information was fragmented and uncertain, it was the first time a possible suspect's behavior had been reported so close to the crimes. Frank arranged to meet Victor at the police station. The young man was nervous, fidgeting with his hands, eyes darting as if afraid of being watched even in the bright fluorescent lights of the interrogation room. "I'm not sure what I saw exactly," Victor said, voice low, but it was late, and there was this man standing outside the cafe on Ashby Avenue. He was looking around, like he didn't want to be noticed. Frank leaned forward, attentive. "Can you describe him? Anything at all?" Victor hesitated. "He had a hat, like a fedora or something. Dark clothes, and he was pretty tall. I think I saw him the night Anna disappeared." The detail struck Frank with the familiarity of déjà vu. The hat, the dark clothing, this matched the descriptions from earlier witnesses. He pressed gently for more information, but Victor's memory was hazy, clouded by the passage of time and the stress of being in custody. Despite the vagueness, Frank saw promise. He asked Victor if he could accompany police on patrols near Ashby Avenue. Victor agreed, eager perhaps to be part of something bigger than himself. Over the following weeks, Victor's observations became an informal part of the investigation. He was no detective, but his presence in the neighborhood was noted by locals, some of whom were grateful to see someone watching the streets after dark. His testimony, while imperfect, added a layer of human connection to the case, bridging the gap between the police and the community. Meanwhile, Frank delved deeper into the backgrounds of potential suspects who fit the general description: a man in his 30s or 40s, familiar with the area, possibly someone with a history of violence or mental illness. He reached out to behavioral analysts, hoping to refine the psychological profile. The experts painted a disturbing image: a man with deep-seated resentment, likely toward women, but with a capacity for charm and normalcy that allowed him to blend into everyday life. His crimes were not impulsive but carefully planned, suggesting a long simmering anger turned to violence when triggered by specific cues. Frank thought often about the victim's last known moments, how they might have encountered this man, whether he approached with false kindness or struck from the shadows. The uncertainty gnawed at him. The city's response to the killings was multifaceted. Local women formed watch groups, sharing safety tips and organizing nighttime escorts. Businesses installed better lighting and surveillance cameras. Schools held assemblies to discuss awareness and self-defense. Yet fear was a persistent companion. Mothers cautioned their daughters. Friends watched each other closely. The fog seemed to close tighter around the city, a shroud of collective anxiety. One night, as Frank walked the cold streets near Lake Merritt, he reflected on the fragile balance between fear and hope. The killer was still out there, a ghost moving through the city's veins. And yet, in the faces of the community, especially those who refused to be paralyzed by terror, there was resilience. Back at the precinct,
A new tip came from an unexpected source. A local homeless man, known as Jimmy, reported seeing a man matching the description lurking near the creek where the first victim's body was found. Jimmy was reluctant to talk, but his details were consistent with other accounts. Frank arranged a meeting. Over a cup of stale coffee in the break room, Jimmy described a figure who often sat quietly by the water, watching the fog roll in. "He ain't a regular," Jimmy said. "Likes to keep to himself, but there's something off. Always clean, even in this mess." Though the information was circumstantial, Frank's instincts told him this could be significant. They began canvassing the area, interviewing residents and local business owners, hoping to find anyone who might recognize the man. Weeks passed with no breakthrough. The case was becoming a heavy fog around Frank's heart. The city's vigilance waned as winter moved towards spring. Many hoped the killer might have moved on. Then one rainy evening in late February, the strangler struck again. This time, the victim was a woman named Lisa Benton, a graduate student in sociology, known for her quiet kindness and love of literature. She had been working late at a university library, and was last seen walking toward the bus stop near the waterfront. Her body was found 2 days later, beneath a canopy of willow trees along the East Bay shoreline. The ligature, a length of braided leather, tightly wound around her neck. The scene was eerily similar to previous murders, each detail a cruel signature. The city's sorrow deepened. Vigils were held. Candlelight flickered against the damp fog as families mourned, and the community's resolve hardened. Detective Harper felt the sting of failure sharply. How had they let this happen again? What had been missed? In the days that followed, investigators combed the area with renewed urgency. Forensic teams searched for fibers, DNA, anything that could point to the strangler. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses was reviewed obsessively, looking for any trace of the suspect. Amidst the sorrow, Frank found unexpected strength. He was reminded of why this case mattered, not just as a series of crimes to solve, but as a fight to reclaim the city's sense of safety and dignity. He sat down with the families of the victims, listening to their stories, their pain, their hope. He saw in their eyes the human cost behind the headlines, the shattered dreams, the unanswered questions, and through it all, he knew the East Bay Strangler was not just a name or a headline. He was a man whose darkness had touched so many lives, whose silence and violence spoke of a deeper sorrow. Frank returned to the precinct, determined to see this through. With every new lead, every painstaking interview, he moved closer to lifting the fog that had settled over the city, toward justice for the women who had been lost and peace for those who remained. The days following Lisa Benton's tragic death were among the darkest that the East Bay had seen in years. The community's fear, already simmering under the surface, erupted into a restless anxiety that permeated every corner of the city. Streets once filled with the laughter of children playing after school became eerily silent. Neighbors locked their doors earlier than usual. The fog seemed heavier, as though mourning alongside the city itself. For Detective Frank Harper, the weight of responsibility bore down more heavily than ever. The case had stretched on for months, exhausting his energy and clouding his thoughts. Yet in the quiet moments, those small spaces between chaos, he found renewed determination. This case was no longer about statistics or headlines. It was about people, about justice, about breaking the silence that the Strangler had imposed on so many lives. In the wake of Lisa's murder, the investigation intensified. Frank's team worked around the clock, re-examining every detail, following every lead, no matter how small. Forensics teams combed through evidence with the precision of surgeons, searching for the tiniest clues, fibers caught on clothing, faint fingerprints on glass, the subtle scent left on a ligature. One afternoon, a breakthrough came when the forensic lab reported a partial DNA match found beneath Lisa's fingernails. It was not a complete profile, but it was enough to trigger a renewed search of criminal databases. The DNA belonged to a man with a history of minor assaults, but had never been connected to anything as serious as murder. Frank felt a flicker of hope. They had a name to associate with the ghost who had haunted their city for months. The suspect was a man named Marcus Caldwell, 37 years old, a transient with a history of petty crimes and volatile behavior. He had recently been released from jail after serving a sentence for assaulting a woman. His presence in the East Bay was not well documented, but witnesses described someone who moved quietly through the city's underbelly, someone who did not draw attention, but whose eyes held an unsettling intensity. Frank ordered surveillance on Caldwell. Officers began tracking his movements, hoping to catch him in the act or find further evidence linking him to the murders. Meanwhile, Frank himself took time to visit Caldwell's last known residence, a dilapidated apartment on the outskirts of Oakland. It was a cramped, cluttered space filled with faded photographs, torn newspapers, and scattered belongings that told the story of a man struggling to maintain control over a life unraveling at the edges. Frank's gut told him there was more to Caldwell than the cold record of his crimes. He wondered about the man's past, what had brought him to this point, what had festered in his mind to produce such horror. To understand the Strangler, Frank knew he had to see beyond the violence and into the shadowed corners of a troubled soul. As the surveillance continued, officers noted Caldwell's erratic behavior. He frequented the same parks and alleys where some of the victims had last been seen. He was often seen talking to himself or staring into the fog with vacant eyes. But there was no direct evidence, no confession, no weapon, no incriminating item. The tension mounted as days turned into weeks. The city waited with bated breath, wondering if the killer's shadow would finally be lifted. One cold evening, a call came in from a jogger near the waterfront. They had found a woman, alive but barely conscious, hidden in the reeds by the bay. Her clothes were torn, and her eyes were wide with terror. The woman was Sarah Jenkins, a local artist and beloved community member, who had been missing for 2 days. She told a chilling story, how she had been followed by a man, how he had tried to grab her, how she had fought with every ounce of strength to escape. Her description matched that of Marcus Caldwell. Frank and his team rushed to the location, combing the area for evidence, and organizing a coordinated search. The city's police presence surged as officers patrolled streets and public spaces, eyes sharp for any sign of the suspect. The following night, officers spotted Caldwell near a rundown warehouse by the docks. A tense pursuit ensued, winding through fog-laden streets and abandoned lots. Caldwell was eventually cornered and arrested without incident, his wild eyes betraying a flicker of recognition that the hunt was over. At the station, Caldwell was interrogated extensively. The man was a tangled mix of defiance and despair. He denied the murders at first, then later gave cryptic answers that revealed glimpses of a fractured mind. Psychologists and criminal profilers were brought in to evaluate him. They painted a portrait of a man haunted by trauma, his violent outbursts tied to deep psychological scars. Caldwell had suffered abuse as a child and exhibited signs of personality disorders that had gone untreated. Yet, beneath the chaos was a calculating predator who had carefully hidden his dark impulses behind a mask of normalcy. During the interrogation, Caldwell eventually confessed to the murders, describing with chilling detachment the moments leading up to each attack. He spoke of rage, loneliness, and a twisted desire for control. He named his victims not as people, but as symbols of the pain he carried. Frank listened quietly, the detective's heart heavy with sorrow for both the victims and the man who had become their executioner. The confession brought closure, but not relief. For the families who had lost daughters, sisters, friends, justice was a cold balm on a wound that would never fully heal. For Frank and his colleagues, it was a bittersweet victory, a triumph over darkness tempered by the knowledge of how much had been lost. In the weeks that followed, Caldwell's trial became a focal point for the community. Testimonies from survivors, families, and experts shed light on the depth of the horror. The courtroom was heavy with grief and resolve. Frank attended every day, feeling the weight of every word spoken. The trial was not just about punishment, it was about remembrance, about honoring lives taken too soon, about ensuring that the East Bay would never forget. As Caldwell was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, a cautious hope began to rise across the city. The fog, once a symbol of fear, seemed to lighten. Streets grew busier again. People ventured out after dark, still cautious but less afraid. For Detective Frank Harper, the case remained a defining moment. It was a reminder of the fragility of safety, the resilience of community, and the enduring power of justice. He often returned to the lakeside park, where the final victim had been found, sitting quietly among the trees, the fog swirling gently at his feet. There he found a sense of peace, a space to remember the past, honor the lost, and look toward a future where the city could breathe freely once more. The East Bay Strangler was gone, but his story lingered, a whisper in the fog, a cautionary tale of darkness and light, fear and courage.
In the sprawling urban landscape of Los Angeles during the late 1970s and early 1980s, a shadow lurked quietly among the bustling streets, a shadow that would eventually shake the city's sense of safety to its core. The name Richard Ramirez was unknown then, but it would soon become one of the darkest chapters in the city's history, a name spoken in whispers with a mixture of fear, fascination, and profound sorrow. Ramirez's early years were marked by trauma and instability. Born in El Paso, Texas in 1960, he was raised in a turbulent household. His father, a decorated World War II veteran, was a stern man prone to fits of rage. Richard's mother worked hard but struggled to shield him from the household's volatility. At a young age, Ramirez witnessed horrific scenes, including his cousin's brutal death from a gunshot wound. The exposure to violence planted seeds that would grow in shadowed corners of his psyche. By his teenage years, Ramirez had fallen under the influence of darker elements. He was fascinated by occult imagery, satanic symbolism, and violent media. These obsessions blended with his real-world experiences of abuse and neglect, creating a volatile combination. As a young man, he drifted between cities, Texas, Arizona, and California, committing petty thefts and other small crimes, but soon escalating to more violent acts. It was in California where Ramirez's crimes would escalate into the horrific spree that terrified a city. Dubbed by the media as the Night Stalker, he preyed on victims indiscriminately, choosing houses seemingly at random but with a calculated cruelty. His attacks often happened at night, breaking into homes while the occupants slept, sometimes leaving behind gruesome scenes of violence, sexual assault, and murder. His victims were diverse, men and women, young and old, from different ethnic and socio-economic backgrounds. This randomness made the Night Stalker's rampage all the more terrifying, as no one felt truly safe. His attacks were characterized by a chilling combination of brutality and calculated control. He would enter homes through unlocked doors or windows, often terrorizing victims for hours before the final tragic act. The first known murder attributed to Ramirez occurred in June 1984, when 79-year-old Jenny Vinco was found beaten and sexually assaulted in her Los Angeles home. The following months saw a rising pattern: multiple murders, attempted murders, and assaults across various neighborhoods, from affluent suburbs to modest communities. One aspect that haunted investigators and the public was Ramirez's apparent delight in taunting his victims and law enforcement. He left behind satanic symbols, such as pentagrams, at crime scenes, and he was rumored to have shouted "Hail Satan" during at least one attack. This added a layer of psychological terror that gripped the city's imagination and fed sensational media coverage. As the body count rose, the pressure on law enforcement intensified. The Los Angeles Police Department, alongside other agencies, formed a task force dedicated to catching the Night Stalker. Detectives pored over evidence, looking for any patterns, fingerprints, shoe prints, car sightings, but Ramirez's erratic movements and seemingly random choice of victims made profiling difficult. What complicated the case further was Ramirez's transient lifestyle. He traveled frequently, sleeping in various locations, staying with acquaintances, and avoiding patterns. His ability to slip in and out of communities, blending into crowds, made him a ghost haunting the city. Despite the chaos, there were moments of hope. Survivors who escaped the attacks provided descriptions that helped shape a composite sketch, though it was rough. Neighborhood watch groups formed, residents bolted doors and windows, and the city held its collective breath. In August 1985, the breaking point came when Ramirez was finally recognized by civilians in East Los Angeles. After a chance sighting, residents chased and captured him, handing him over to the police. His arrest ended a terrifying chapter, but opened another one of trial media spectacle and the painful aftermath for victims and families. Richard Ramirez's trial revealed more about his disturbed mind and the depths of his cruelty. He showed no remorse, often speaking openly about his devotion to satanic beliefs and violent fantasies. His charismatic yet chilling courtroom presence polarized public opinion, drawing fascination and horror. The victims and their families, though forever marked by loss and trauma, found some measure of justice when Ramirez was convicted of 13 counts of murder and numerous other charges, sentenced to death in 1989. Yet, the scars left on Los Angeles remained deep and enduring. Ramirez died in 2013 from complications related to cancer, while still on death row, leaving behind a legacy of pain, fear, and questions about the nature of evil, the failures of systems meant to protect, and the human capacity for darkness. In the wake of Richard Ramirez's arrest, the city of Los Angeles found itself struggling to come to terms with the scale of the horror that had unfolded over the previous year. The fear that had gripped neighborhoods, the whispered conversations behind locked doors, the sleepless nights, these collective experiences now merged into a complex mosaic of trauma and unresolved grief. For many, the story of the Night Stalker was not just about the man who committed the crimes, but about the lives he had irrevocably altered. The victims who survived his attacks, the families who mourned the lost, and the communities that bore the weight of suspicion, fear, and vulnerability. One of the most haunting aspects of Ramirez's crimes was his apparent randomness. Unlike many serial offenders whose victims share common characteristics, or who operate within a defined area, Ramirez's selection seemed indiscriminate. He crossed social, economic, and racial boundaries with equal disregard, leaving investigators puzzled and the public on edge. The psychological impact on survivors was profound. Take, for example, Maria Hernandez, who was attacked in her home in the middle of the night. She survived, but the scars, both physical and emotional, remained. In interviews years later, Maria spoke softly about how the memory of that night lingered like a shadow she could never fully shake. "I remember the fear," she said quietly. "Not just in that moment, but afterward, every time the phone rang late at night, every time I heard a noise in the house. It changed how I saw the world, how safe I thought it was." This sense of shattered security was echoed across countless households throughout Los Angeles during that summer and fall of 1984 into 1985. Doors were bolted, windows barred, and families turned inward, often wary of neighbors and strangers alike. Ramirez's use of satanic imagery added a sinister layer that fed into a broader cultural panic of the time. The 1980s were rife with media stories about occult practices and ritualistic crimes, and Ramirez's acts were sensationalized in ways that sometimes obscured the human suffering beneath. Yet the symbols he left behind, pentagrams drawn in blood or scrawled on walls, were not mere theatrics. They reflected a disturbing fixation that colored his crimes and personality. Experts who studied Ramirez's psychological profile later noted his fascination with the occult as both a form of self-empowerment and a mask for deep-seated rage and alienation. It was a way to assert control over victims, to instill fear, and perhaps also to satisfy twisted fantasies that intertwined violence and belief. His childhood, as revealed through court documents and witness testimony, painted a portrait of a boy who had suffered neglect and abuse, who had early exposure to violence that was not just witnessed, but absorbed into his sense of self. His father's violent outbursts and his cousin's traumatic death were key elements that, while not excusing his actions, help explain how such darkness could grow within a person. This raises difficult questions about the roots of evil and the nature of justice. What separates a troubled youth from a serial killer? How does one intervene before tragedy strikes? These are questions that linger beyond the headlines and the trials, pressing on the consciences of investigators, psychologists, and society at large. The law enforcement efforts to catch Ramirez were relentless. The task force that formed brought together officers from multiple jurisdictions, united by a common goal, but also challenged by the sheer randomness of the attacks. Traditional methods of profiling and pattern recognition were stretched thin. Technology, too, played a role. Fingerprint analysis, shoe print comparison, and emerging forensic techniques helped link different crime scenes. Yet it was the community's vigilance that finally brought Ramirez to justice. The night of his capture was marked by a surge of collective courage. After a chance encounter where Ramirez was spotted by a man in East Los Angeles, a group of residents banded together to chase and detain him until police arrived. This moment underscored the tension between fear and resilience, between victimization and empowerment. In the courtroom, Ramirez's behavior was unsettling. He smiled at times, sometimes mocked the proceedings, and frequently spoke about his allegiance to Satanism. His charisma, coupled with his unapologetic demeanor, created a surreal atmosphere. To some he appeared almost theatrical, a man playing a role in his own nightmare. Yet beneath the spectacle was a man who had committed brutal acts of violence against innocent people. The trial brought to light the stories of victims whose lives were ended or shattered, each testimony a painful reminder of loss and survival. Families of the victims grappled publicly with their grief. Many struggled to find meaning or closure, while others used the platform to advocate for victims' rights and awareness about violence prevention. The trial, lasting over a year, became a focal point for these voices. Ramirez was ultimately convicted on 13 counts of murder, as well as multiple counts of attempted murder, sexual assault, and burglary. The verdict offered a legal resolution but did not erase the emotional wounds left in its wake. In the years that followed, the story of the Night Stalker became part of Los Angeles's dark history, a reminder of the fragility of safety and the complexities of evil. Ramirez remained on death row until his death in 2013 from complications related to lymphoma, never expressing remorse or providing clear explanations for his actions. The legacy of Richard Ramirez extends beyond the man himself. It is found in the stories of those he touched, directly and indirectly, the survivors who rebuilt their lives, the families who continue to mourn, and the community that once lived in fear. His case also prompted changes in law enforcement practices and public awareness about personal safety. Neighborhood watch programs strengthened, police community communication improved, and the media's role in reporting violent crime was scrutinized more carefully. Perhaps most importantly, Ramirez's crimes challenged society to confront uncomfortable truths about violence, trauma, and the human condition. How do we recognize the signs of a future offender? How do we support those who suffer in silence? And how do we heal from wounds that defy easy closure? The answers remain complex and incomplete, but the hope is that by remembering these stories with care and empathy, there is a chance to prevent future tragedies. As the dust settled after Richard Ramirez's arrest and trial, the city of Los Angeles continued to wrestle with the lingering aftermath of his violent spree. The wounds left behind were not only physical but psychological, rippling through the communities where he had struck, and leaving a profound impact on the way society viewed both crime and safety. One of the most significant challenges was understanding how someone like Ramirez could slip through the cracks for so long. His path to becoming the Night Stalker was marked by missed opportunities for intervention, a series of small failures in social services, education, and community support that might have altered his trajectory. In the years following his conviction, experts in criminal psychology and law enforcement began dissecting his case to glean insights about serial killers' motivations, behaviors, and warning signs. Ramirez's background provided a stark example of how childhood trauma, environmental factors, and personal choices can converge into a deadly combination. Born into a household troubled by domestic violence,
neglect, and early exposure to brutality, Ramirez's childhood was anything but stable. His father's volatile temper and his cousin's gruesome death created a backdrop of violence and fear. Yet, beyond these early traumas, his teenage years reflected a growing fascination with the dark and occult. Friends and acquaintances recalled a young man who was withdrawn but intense, with a strange allure that mixed charm and menace. He gravitated toward images of death and darkness, immersing himself in books and music that glorified evil or rebellion. This fascination was not unique to Ramirez, but combined with his personal circumstances, it became a dangerous fixation. Ramirez's crimes were also notable for their calculated randomness. Unlike many serial killers who follow a consistent pattern, targeting victims based on age, gender, or location, Ramirez seemed to attack without clear rhyme or reason. This unpredictability not only baffled law enforcement but magnified public fear, as no one felt truly safe. His attacks were brutal and invasive, breaking into homes while occupants slept or went about their routines. He used weapons ranging from guns to knives and employed tactics that instilled terror beyond the physical harm. Survivors described the profound psychological impact, the lingering fear, nightmares, and shattered sense of security. One survivor, a young woman named Michelle, recounted her experience with a calm, measured voice years later. "It wasn't just the pain or the fear in the moment," she said. "It was knowing that someone could enter your life so violently, so suddenly, and leave you forever changed. You don't just get over that." Her story echoed many others, accounts filled with quiet resilience, but also a deep sadness. Recovery was uneven, often complicated by societal stigma around sexual assault and violence. Mental health resources were scarce, and many survivors struggled in isolation. The law enforcement community, too, learned harsh lessons from the Night Stalker case. The initial difficulty in linking the crimes, due to jurisdictional boundaries and the scattered nature of the attacks, highlighted weaknesses in communication between agencies. The task force formed to catch Ramirez became a model for future multi-agency cooperation. Forensic science, still developing at the time, played a pivotal role in piecing together the case. Advances in fingerprint analysis, shoe print comparisons, and crime scene documentation gradually built a profile that narrowed the suspect pool. These tools, while powerful, were labor-intensive and required meticulous coordination. The media's coverage of the Night Stalker also brought challenges. Sensational headlines and dramatic portrayals of satanic rituals fueled public hysteria. While this attention kept the case in the spotlight, it sometimes distorted facts and overshadowed the humanity of the victims. Some commentators and experts argued that the satanic angle, while part of Ramirez's self-presentation, was overemphasized to the detriment of understanding the root causes of his behavior. It became clear that beyond the symbols and declarations, the core of his crimes lay in control, domination, and profound psychological disturbance. In court, Ramirez maintained a defiant posture. His courtroom behavior, smiling, drawing pentagrams on his hand, making chilling declarations, perplexed observers. To many, he appeared to revel in the attention, turning his trial into a stage. His lack of remorse was particularly disturbing for families seeking closure. Yet it also sparked reflection on the nature of evil and the limits of human empathy. How does one comprehend a mind so deeply severed from conventional morality? How does justice respond when remorse is absent? The sentencing in 1989 brought some resolution, but the effects of Ramirez's crimes continued to ripple. Victim advocacy groups gained momentum, pushing for reforms in how survivors of violent crimes were supported. Awareness campaigns sought to educate the public on personal safety, while communities worked to rebuild trust. Ramirez himself remained on death row for more than 2 decades, a figure frozen in time amid shifting debates about capital punishment and criminal justice. His death in 2013 from lymphoma did not close the chapter. It reopened conversations about rehabilitation, punishment, and memory. Throughout the city, memories of the Night Stalker lingered in subtle ways. Some homes that had been targeted were eventually demolished or sold, their histories too painful to bear. Others became sites of remembrance, quiet testimonies to resilience and survival. Psychologists who worked with survivors emphasized the ongoing nature of healing. Trauma from such violence often unfolded in waves, flashbacks, anxiety, mistrust, that could emerge years after the event. Support systems were crucial, but unevenly available. In a broader cultural sense, Ramirez's story became part of the American narrative about serial killers, figures who fascinate and horrify in equal measure. Books, documentaries, and podcasts retold his crimes with varying degrees of sensitivity, exploring not just the facts but the emotional and societal implications. What remains clear is that behind the headlines and sensational stories are real people, victims and families, whose lives were irrevocably altered. Their stories deserve to be told with care, respect, and an understanding of the complex human realities involved. As law enforcement and society continue to confront violent crime, the lessons from the Night Stalker case endure. They serve as reminders of the need for vigilance, compassion, and a commitment to addressing the roots of violence before it manifests in tragedy. The final chapter in the saga of Richard Ramirez unfolds not just in courtrooms or prison cells, but within the hearts of those whose lives he touched and shattered. The ripples of his violence, like shadows cast long after sunset, extend beyond what headlines or court transcripts can convey. They reside in memories, in quiet moments of reflection, in the enduring struggle for peace. After Ramirez was convicted on 13 counts of murder and numerous other charges, including attempted murder, sexual assault, and burglary, the legal proceedings moved towards sentencing. The gravity of his crimes demanded the harshest punishment, and California's death penalty statute was set in motion. He was sentenced to death in 1989 and sent to San Quentin State Prison. Yet even behind bars, Ramirez's story was marked by complexity and contradiction. During his years on death row, he became a figure who continued to fascinate and perplex those following his case. Some of this was fueled by media attention, which often portrayed him as a dark enigma. Others saw his incarceration as a necessary containment of a dangerous force. However, there were moments that complicated this picture. Reports emerged of Ramirez adopting a Muslim faith, changing his name to Abdullah, and expressing remorse for his actions. Some survivors and families found this hard to reconcile, while others saw it as a sign of the unpredictable ways human beings seek meaning and redemption, even in the bleakest circumstances. The years that followed were marked by slow, often frustrating legal processes. Appeals and motions filed by Ramirez's defense team sought to challenge his conviction and death sentence, but courts consistently upheld the verdict. Meanwhile, the death penalty itself became a subject of heated debate in California and across the nation. Opponents cited concerns about the fairness of capital punishment, its moral implications, and the risk of wrongful executions. Supporters argued that for crimes as heinous as Ramirez's, the ultimate sentence was justified. This tension reflected broader societal questions about justice and the appropriate response to extreme violence. In 2013, Ramirez's death from complications related to B-cell lymphoma brought an end to his life, but not to the conversation his case sparked. His passing was noted with a mixture of relief, sorrow, and reflection. For many survivors and families, it was a moment to confront lingering feelings, grief, anger, perhaps even a tentative sense of closure. The legacy of the Night Stalker is not confined to his own story, but interwoven with the lives of those who endured his attacks. Many survivors continued to navigate the long path of recovery, a process often invisible to the outside world, but profound and demanding. Mental health professionals who worked with survivors described trauma as a persistent companion. For some, the fear instilled by Ramirez's crimes led to heightened anxiety, sleep disturbances, and difficulties trusting others. Others struggled with survivors' guilt or the challenge of reclaiming a sense of normalcy. Community support played a crucial role. Survivor groups and advocacy organizations offered spaces for shared understanding and healing. These connections helped dismantle isolation and foster resilience. In some cases, survivors became advocates themselves, speaking out to raise awareness and promote prevention. Families of victims carried their own burdens. The loss of loved ones to violent crime is a grief that defies easy expression or resolution. Many found solace in remembrance, memorials, charities, or quiet rituals honoring those taken too soon. At the societal level, Ramirez's crimes influenced changes in law enforcement practices and public awareness. Police agencies enhanced communication and collaboration, especially across jurisdictional lines. The case highlighted the importance of rapid information sharing and the integration of forensic advancements. The public's relationship with crime and safety was also shaped. Fear, while understandable, was tempered by a growing recognition of the need for balanced responses that respected both security and civil liberties. Education campaigns stressed practical safety measures without fueling panic. Perhaps most importantly, the case underscored the critical role of early intervention and community support. Many who studied Ramirez's life pointed to opportunities missed, moments where counseling, social services, or stable family environments might have altered the course of his development. The story of the Night Stalker invites contemplation on the nature of evil and the human capacity for both harm and healing. It challenges us to consider how society can better identify and address risk factors, while offering compassion and resources to those at risk. In reflecting on this case, it is essential to remember that the victims were not just statistics or headlines, but individuals with hopes, dreams, and relationships. Their humanity deserves recognition and respect beyond the shadow cast by their assailant. The cultural imprint of the Night Stalker persists in subtle ways. Books, documentaries, and discussions revisit the events with varying tones, some investigative, others cautionary. While these retellings risk sensationalism, many strive to honor the complexity of the people involved. For the city of Los Angeles, Ramirez's era remains a painful chapter, but also a catalyst for growth. Communities rebuilt trust, law enforcement refined methods, and survivors found paths forward. The scars, though deep, became part of a shared history that informs current efforts to prevent violence. In quiet moments, one can sense the lingering echo of those dark nights, but also the strength of those who refused to be defined by fear. The Night Stalker's reign ended with his capture, but the resilience of survivors and communities continues. Ultimately, this story is a somber reminder of the fragility of safety and the enduring need for vigilance, compassion, and justice. It calls on us to listen, to victims, to experts, and to one another, and to work toward a world where such shadows are less frequent and healing more possible. Thank you for listening.